The Legal Vigilante, The Last Appeal. Chapter 1. The Letter of the Law. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. David Mercer never breaks the law. He simply knows laws that everyone else has forgotten. David Mercer believed this with the quiet certainty that most men reserve for their faith or the love of their mothers. For 23 years, he had built his life, his career, his reputation, his very identity, around this singular conviction. The law was not merely a collection of statutes and precedents, not simply words printed on paper and bound between leather covers. It was a living thing, a breathing organism that pulsed through the veins of civilization itself. It was the great leveler, the impartial arbiter, the shield that protected the weak from the predations of the strong. His office on the third floor of a Georgian building overlooking the Thames was a testament to this belief. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, the shelves sagging under the weight of case reports, legal commentaries, and bound volumes of statutes dating back to the reign of Henry VIII. The leather-bound chairs were worn smooth by decades of clients seeking counsel. The mahogany desk, scarred and stained, had belonged to his grandfather, who had also been a solicitor, and his great-grandfather before that. The Mercer family had been practicing law in London for over 150 years, and David had always felt the weight of that legacy pressing down upon him. He was 52 years old, with thinning grey hair that he still combed with the precision of a man who believed in order, and wire-rimmed spectacles that had become as much a part of his face as his nose or his eyes. His suits were always perfectly pressed, his ties always perfectly knotted, his arguments always perfectly constructed. He was known at the bar as a man who could find a precedent for anything, who could quote obscure statutes from memory, who could dismantle an opposing counsel's argument with the surgical precision of a man who had spent his life studying the intricate machinery of justice. His greatest achievement, however, was not the difficult cases he had won or the prestigious clients he had represented. It was his daughter, Emily. She was 17 now, and she had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's quiet determination. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, a rich auburn that caught the light in ways that always made David think of fire. Her eyes were the soft grey of the Thames on a winter morning, and when she smiled, which she did often, despite the tragedies that had marked her young life, the entire world seemed to brighten. Her mother, David's wife Catherine, had died when Emily was only 6. A car accident on the M25, a moment of inattention from a lorry driver, and just like that, the woman who had been David's partner for 15 years was gone. He had raised Emily alone, navigating the treacherous waters of single parenthood with the same methodical approach he brought to his legal work. He had researched every parenting book, consulted every expert, and applied every lesson with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him such a formidable solicitor. And Emily had thrived. She was bright and curious, with a passion for art that had surprised and delighted her father. She spent hours in her room, paintbrushes dancing across canvases, creating worlds of color and light that seemed to exist outside the grey confines of London. She had been accepted to the Slade School of Fine Art, one of the most prestigious art institutions in the country, and David had never been prouder of anyone or anything in his life. She was walking home from a friend's house when everything changed. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the rain was falling in that peculiarly London way, not a dramatic downpour, but a persistent, penetrating drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. The streets of Chiswick, where they lived, were quiet, the evening commuters already home, the restaurants and pubs beginning to fill with the weekend crowd. Emily had texted him at 6:47 p.m., letting him know she was on her way. He had replied with a simple "be safe, love," a message he sent every time she went out, a ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. The attack occurred in an alley off Devonshire Road, a narrow cut through that connected 2 residential streets. It was the kind of shortcut that locals used to shave a few minutes off their walk, a passage that was well lit and generally considered safe. But that evening, the streetlight at the entrance to the alley had been broken. Later investigations would reveal that it had been reported to the council 3 weeks earlier but never repaired. Emily never saw it coming. One moment she was walking, her headphones in her ears, a painting of a sunset she had been working on still dancing through her mind. The next moment, there was a hand over her mouth, an arm around her throat, and she was being dragged into the shadows. The attack lasted perhaps 5 minutes. It felt like eternity. When it was over, Emily lay crumpled on the wet pavement, her clothes torn, her body bruised and bleeding. Her headphones had been ripped from her ears and lay in a puddle, still playing the music she had been listening to, a gentle piano piece that now seemed like a mockery of the violence that had just occurred. A woman walking her dog found her 10 minutes later. She called an ambulance and stayed with Emily until it arrived, holding her hand and speaking in soothing tones that Emily could barely hear through the fog of shock and pain. The hospital called David at 8:15 p.m. He was in his study, reviewing a particularly complex property dispute, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, an unrecognized number, and almost let it go to voicemail. But some instinct that had always guided him in his legal work, made him answer. Mr. Mercer. The voice on the other end was female, professional, but with an undercurrent of something that made David's heart clench. This is Nurse Patel from St. Mary's Hospital. Your daughter has been brought in. There's been an incident. You need to come immediately. David doesn't remember the drive to the hospital. He remembers fragments, the rain on the windscreen, the blur of streetlights, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white. He remembers the hospital's fluorescent lights, too bright and too cold, and the smell of antiseptic that seemed to cling to everything. He remembers the sight of his daughter, his beautiful, vibrant Emily, lying in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of her arms and her face a grotesque canvas of purple and black bruising. Dad, she whispered when she saw him, and the sound of her voice, so small and broken, shattered something inside him that he had never known existed. He sat beside her bed for the next 3 hours, holding her hand, speaking in the same soft, soothing tones that the woman with the dog had used. He told her she was safe, that he was there, that nothing would ever hurt her again. He made promises he didn't yet know if he could keep. The doctors told him she would survive. The physical injuries, the broken ribs, the fractured wrist, the deep laceration on her cheek that would leave a permanent scar, would heal. The psychological wounds were another matter entirely. They would need time, therapy, and an enormous amount of patience. The police arrived the next morning. Detective Inspector Raymond Miller was a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a permanent expression of weary resignation that seemed to be the default setting for anyone who had spent too long working the streets of London. He sat down with David in a small, windowless room near the hospital chapel and explained that they were doing everything they could. We have officers canvassing the area, Miller said, his voice flat and unconvincing. We are looking for witnesses, checking CCTV footage. These cases can be difficult, Mr. Mercer, but we'll find whoever did this. David nodded. He was trained to read people, to detect the subtle tells that betrayed deception or uncertainty. Miller was a good detective, or at least a competent one, but David could see the doubt lurking behind his professional demeanor. The alley where Emily had been attacked was poorly lit, the CCTV cameras in the area were old and unreliable, and there were no eyewitnesses who could provide a clear description of the attacker. Keep me informed, David said, his voice calm and measured. I want to know everything. Miller promised he would. He was a man of his word, and he did keep David informed, at least initially. He called with updates that were never quite updates, with leads that always seemed to go nowhere. The witness statements were contradictory. The CCTV footage, what little there was too grainy to be useful. The forensic evidence was inconclusive. David, for his part, did everything by the book. He filed the appropriate requests, spoke to the appropriate people, followed the appropriate procedures. He trusted the system, because the system was all he had ever known. The law, he believed, would find its way to the truth. It always did. Emily was discharged from the hospital after a week. David brought her home and set her up in her room, surrounding her with her art supplies and her books and everything that might bring her comfort. She rarely spoke. She rarely ate. She lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, her eyes empty, her spirit crushed. David tried to be patient. He tried to be strong. He tried to be everything his daughter needed him to be. But inside, something was beginning to shift. Something cold and hard was forming in the place where his faith in the system had once resided. Weeks passed. Then months. The initial flurry of police activity died down, replaced by a silence that was more damning than any admission of failure. Miller's calls became less frequent, and when they came, they were filled with apologies and excuses that David had heard before. I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer. We are doing everything we can. These things take time. There's just not enough evidence to move forward. The last call came in February. Miller sounded genuinely contrite, but the message was devastating. The Crown Prosecution Service has decided there isn't enough evidence to proceed with a case, he said. The file is being closed. David sat in his study, the phone still pressed to his ear, and listened to Miller's apologies with a sense of detached unreality. The file was being closed. The investigation was over. The man who had attacked his daughter, who had beaten her, violated her, and left her for dead in a rain-soaked alley, was going to walk free. He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. When he finally moved, it was with a purpose that he had never felt before. He wasn't angry. Anger was a useless emotion, a fire that burned bright but quickly consumed itself. What David felt was something far more dangerous, a cold, implacable determination that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with purpose. He had spent his entire life believing that justice arrived on its own, that the system would eventually find its way to the truth. He had been wrong. The system had failed. The law, the very thing he had dedicated his life to, had let his daughter down. But the law was not the problem. The law was simply a tool, and like any tool, it could be used or misused. The problem was that the people who were supposed to wield the law had forgotten how to use it. They had become complacent, lazy, corrupt. They had abandoned the principles that David had spent his life defending. He looked at the books on his shelves, the leather-bound volumes of statutes and precedents that represented centuries of legal tradition. He had always seen them as the foundation of justice. Now he saw them for what they really were, weapons. Weapons that could be turned against the very people who had failed to protect his daughter. He resigned from his law firm the next morning. His partners were shocked. He had been with the firm for 23 years, had built it from a small practice into one of the most respected in London. They offered him more money, more vacation time, a partnership in name if not in practice. He declined them all. He had a new purpose now. The purpose wasn't revenge. Revenge was a petty emotion, a base instinct that offered only temporary satisfaction. What David wanted was something far more profound. He wanted to remind the world that the law still existed, that it still had power, that it could still be used to expose the truth and bring the guilty to justice. He started with the Freedom of Information Act. It was a law that had been passed with great fanfare in 2000, heralded as a new era of government transparency and accountability. In practice, it had become another tool for bureaucrats to delay and obfuscate, to bury requests in paperwork and technicalities until the requester gave up in frustration. David had no intention of giving up. His first request was to the local council, asking for all records related to the maintenance of street lighting in the area where Emily had been attacked. It was a simple request, perfectly legal, and entirely within the bounds of the law. The council responded with a series of delaying tactics. They asked for clarification, claimed the request was too broad, sought extensions to the statutory time limits. David responded to each delaying tactic with a meticulously crafted letter, citing the precise provisions of the Act and the penalties for non-compliance. It took 3 months, but eventually, the council released the records. David spent a week going through them, page by page, line by line. He was looking for something specific, something that would tell him why the streetlight in that particular alley had been broken for 3 weeks without being repaired. What he found was more than he had ever hoped for. Chapter 2, The Fracture. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed their sterile drone, a sound that would forever be etched into David Mercer's memory alongside the antiseptic smell and the 2 bright white walls. He had been sitting in this chair, a hard plastic thing designed for function rather than comfort, for 3 hours now. His back ached, his eyes burned, and his hands, usually so steady, trembled in his lap. He looked at his daughter, Emily, lying in the hospital bed, and felt something crack inside him. Not break, not shatter, crack. A hairline fracture in the bedrock of his being. A fissure that would, in time, widen into a chasm. Her face was a ruin of purple and black bruising. One eye was swollen completely shut, the other a narrow slit through which she could barely see. Her lower lip was split, the stitches raw and angry. A bandage covered the left side of her face, hiding the deep laceration that the doctors said would leave a permanent scar. But it was her eyes that shattered him most. Those grey eyes that had always held such warmth, such life, such joy. They were empty now. Hollow. The eyes of someone who had seen something that could never be unseen. Dad. The word was barely a whisper, a ghost of the vibrant voice that had once filled their home with laughter. I'm here, Emily. He took her hand, careful not to press too hard on the 4 line that snaked into her wrist. I'm right here. Dad, she said again, and then she was crying, great heaving sobs that seemed to shake her entire body. David pulled her close, careful not to hurt her, and held her while she wept. He felt her tears soaking through his shirt, felt the trembling of her small frame, and he held her tighter, as if he could somehow absorb her pain into himself. He didn't cry. He couldn't. The tears were there, a pressure behind his eyes, a burning in his throat, but they wouldn't come. He was too far gone for tears, too disconnected from his own emotions. All he felt was the cold, implacable rage that had been growing inside him since the moment he'd received that phone call. "I can't go home," Emily whispered when her sobs had subsided. "I can't go back there. He knows where I live. He's going to find me." "Emily, listen to me." David pulled back, meeting her one good eye with the most intense look he could muster. "No one is going to hurt you. I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. He had made promises before, promises to protect her, to keep her safe, and he had failed. He had let her walk home alone, had let her walk through that alley, had let her become a target. He would never make that mistake again. But the damage was done. The trust was broken. The world that Emily had known, a world where bad things happened to other people, not to her, had been shattered. The doctors came and went. They checked her vitals, changed her dressings, administered more pain medication. They spoke in low, professional voices, using terms that David barely registered. Concussion. Fractured ribs. Surgical repair. Scarring. The words were clinical, detached, as if they were talking about a broken appliance rather than his daughter. The police arrived the next morning. Detective Inspector Raymond Miller was a man who had clearly seen too much. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but David could see the weariness behind it, the accumulated weight of years spent dealing with the worst of humanity. He was a big man, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome once but had been worn down by too many sleepless nights and too many cups of bad coffee. He wore a cheap suit that didn't quite fit and carried a battered briefcase that looked older than David's law degree. "Mr. Mercer." Miller extended his hand. "I'm Detective Inspector Miller. I've been assigned to your daughter's case." David shook the offered hand. Miller's grip was firm but not aggressive, professional. "Thank you for coming, Detective. I want to know everything. What happened? Who did this? Where they are now?" Miller nodded, his expression grave. "I understand your urgency, Mr. Mercer. But I need to be honest with you. These cases are often difficult. The attacker struck quickly, and there were no direct witnesses. We are doing everything we can, but..." "But what?" David's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Miller pause. "But you can't find him. But you're going to give up." "Mr. Mercer, I'm not going to give up. I'm just saying that these things take time." "Time." The word came out like a curse. "Emily doesn't have time. She's lying in a hospital bed, Detective. She's scared and hurt and traumatized, and you're telling me that you need time." Miller's face hardened slightly. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Mercer. I really do. But I have other cases to investigate, limited resources, and a mountain of paperwork. I will do everything I can to find your daughter's attacker, but I can't promise you a quick resolution." David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He was a solicitor, a man who dealt with difficult clients and impossible situations every day. He knew how to navigate these conversations. He knew when to push and when to back off. "I appreciate your honesty, Detective," he said, his voice returning to its normal measured tones. "And I appreciate the work you're doing. I just want to make sure that everything possible is being done." "Of course." Miller nodded, his expression softening. "We are canvassing the area, checking CCTV footage, interviewing potential witnesses. If there's any evidence to be found, we'll find it." The investigation proceeded with agonizing slowness. David, who had spent his entire career navigating the legal system, found himself on the other side of the process, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. He called Miller's office every day, spoke to the desk sergeant, filed formal requests for updates. He was patient, professional, and utterly relentless. But the answers, when they came, were always the same. The investigation was ongoing. The leads were being followed. There was nothing new to report. 3 weeks after the attack, David began to suspect that something was wrong. It wasn't anything specific, just a growing sense that the investigation was not proceeding as it should. Witnesses who had seemed eager to help had suddenly become uncooperative. CCTV footage that had been promised had somehow been lost. The forensic evidence, what little there was, had been sent to a lab that seemed to be taking an inordinate amount of time to produce results. David, who had spent his career building cases and deconstructing opposing arguments, began to see the patterns. The delays, the excuses, the sudden reluctance to share information, these were all signs of obstruction. Someone was interfering with the investigation. But who? And why? It was Miller who finally broke the news. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer." The detective's voice was heavy with resignation. "The Crown Prosecution Service has reviewed the evidence, and they've decided there isn't enough to proceed. The file is being closed." "There isn't enough evidence." David's voice was dangerously quiet. "Detective, you haven't found any evidence because you haven't been looking. You've been stalling, dragging your feet, hoping I would go away." "That's not true, Mr. Mercer. We've done everything we can." "Have you?" David's control snapped. "Have you really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you gave up before you even started. Emily was attacked, detective. She was beaten and violated and left for dead. And you're telling me that the case has been closed because there isn't enough evidence? What kind of justice is that?" Miller's face was pale, his jaw tight. "I understand your anger, Mr. Mercer. I truly do. But the law is the law. Without evidence, we can't prosecute. That's just the way it works." "The way it works." David laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "You think I don't know how it works? I've spent 23 years practicing law, detective. I know exactly how it works. And I know when I'm being lied to." "Mr. Mercer, I want the case file. All of it. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every report. I want to see what you've been hiding." "I can't do that. The case file is confidential." "I'll get a court order." David's voice was ice. "I'll file a Freedom of Information request. I'll appeal to the Information Commissioner. I'll take this all the way to the Supreme Court if I have to. You can't stop me, detective. I know the law, and I know how to use it." Miller stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll see what I can do." The file arrived 3 weeks later, heavily redacted, missing entire sections, stripped of anything that might have been useful. David went through it with a fine-tooth comb, cross-referencing every piece of information, following every lead, no matter how small. What he found was a pattern of incompetence that bordered on malfeasance. Witness statements that had been collected but never followed up. Forensic evidence that had been lost before it could be properly analyzed. CCTV footage that had been corrupted or unavailable. It wasn't just incompetence. It was deliberate obstruction. Someone had been interfering with the investigation from the very beginning. Someone with enough power to make witnesses change their stories, to make evidence disappear, to make a case that should have been open and shut vanish into bureaucratic limbo. David began to understand the magnitude of what he was facing. He wasn't just fighting a broken system. He was fighting a system that had been actively corrupted. And that was when he made his decision. He resigned from his law firm the next morning. His partners were shocked. "You're making a mistake," they said. "You have a brilliant career ahead of you. You can't throw it all away for one case." But David was already gone. Not physically. He was still sitting in their conference room, still wearing his expensive suit, still projecting the calm competence that had made him one of the most respected solicitors in London. But somewhere deep inside, the man they knew had ceased to exist. In his place was something new. Something cold and implacable. Something that would stop at nothing to find the truth. He moved his work to a small study in his home, a room that had once been a guest bedroom but was now filled with filing cabinets, legal texts, and the detritus of a life that had been dismantled and reassembled into something entirely new. He told himself that he wasn't doing this for revenge. Revenge was petty, meaningless, a distraction from the real goal. What he wanted was justice. Real justice, not the hollow imitation that the legal system had offered his daughter. But as the weeks passed and the investigation consumed him, even David began to question his own motives. The lines between justice and obsession, between righteous anger and blind rage, began to blur. He barely slept, barely ate. The world outside his study ceased to exist. His only focus was the case, the endless threads of evidence that he was slowly gathering, the growing web of connections that he was beginning to trace. Emily, who had moved back home and was slowly recovering, watched her father with a mixture of concern and gratitude. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she could see the change in him, the way his eyes had gone cold and distant, the way his hands never seemed to stop moving. "Dad!" She stood in the doorway of his study, her voice small and uncertain. "Are you okay?" David looked up from the file he was reading, his expression softening slightly when he saw her.
I'm fine, Em.
"How are you feeling?"
I'm okay.
She stepped into the room, looking around at the chaos of papers and files. "What are you doing?" "I'm working on your case." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm going to find the man who hurt you, Emily. I'm going to bring him to justice." "But the police said." "The police are wrong." David's voice was firm, unyielding. "They gave up too easily. They didn't look hard enough. But I'm not going to give up. I'm never going to give up." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face. Then she nodded slowly and turned away. "Emily." David's voice stopped her at the door. "I'm doing this for you. Everything I'm doing, it's for you." "I know, Dad." She didn't turn around. "That's what worries me." Chapter 3. The Official Record. The Freedom of Information Act had been designed to make government more transparent, to give citizens access to the information that their tax dollars had paid for. In practice, it had become a bureaucratic nightmare, a system designed more to frustrate requesters than to provide them with useful information. David Mercer knew this better than most. He had spent years using the Act to gather information for his clients, navigating the labyrinth of exemptions and exceptions that had been built into the legislation. He knew the tricks that government departments use to delay and deny requests, the technicalities they invoke to avoid compliance. He also knew how to fight them. His first request was to the Metropolitan Police, asking for all records related to the investigation of the attack on Emily Mercer. It was a straightforward request, perfectly legal, and entirely within the bounds of the Act. The response came within a few days. His request had been denied. The police claimed that the information was exempt under Section 30 of the Act, which covered investigations and proceedings conducted by public authorities. The exemption was absolute, they said, and there was no public interest that could override it. David had expected this. He had prepared for it. He immediately filed an internal appeal, arguing that the public interest in the case, a violent attack on a minor in a public space, far outweighed any potential harm to the investigation. The appeal was rejected. The police were adamant, the investigation was ongoing, and releasing the information would prejudice their work. David knew this was a lie. The investigation had been closed for weeks. There was no ongoing work to prejudice. The police were simply using the law as a shield, hiding behind bureaucratic technicalities to avoid accountability. He didn't appeal again. Not immediately. He knew that the Information Commissioner's Office, the body that adjudicated FOI disputes, was backed up for months, and even if he eventually won, the delay would be fatal. He needed another approach, a way to force the police's hand without relying on the slow machinery of the legal system. That approach came from an unexpected source, a dusty volume of statutes that he had inherited from his grandfather. The book was old, bound in cracked leather that had once been black but had faded to a dull brown over the decades. It was filled with legislation that had long since been superseded, laws that had been written in a time when the legal system was vastly different from what it was today. But not all of them had been repealed. David had been looking for something else entirely when he came across the 1847 Municipal Corporations Act. He had been searching for a provision that would allow him to access local government records, something that might give him insight into the maintenance of the streetlights in the alley where Emily had been attacked. Instead, he found something far more interesting. The 1847 Act, which had been passed to regulate the powers of municipal corporations, contained a provision that had never been formally repealed. It stated that any ratepayer had the right to inspect all records held by the corporation, including those related to policing and public safety. The provision had been rendered obsolete by subsequent legislation, but it had never been removed from the statute books. It was still technically law, still technically enforceable. And David was a ratepayer. He paid council tax on his home in Chiswick, which meant he was a ratepayer under the terms of the 1847 Act. He began to smile. This was the kind of legal trick that he had spent his career mastering. The law was not just a set of rules, it was a living document, full of contradictions and loopholes, waiting for a skilled practitioner to exploit them. He filed his request under the 1847 Act the next day. He sent it to the local council, not the police, and he worded it carefully, using the precise language of the statute to request access to all records related to the maintenance of street lighting in the area where Emily had been attacked. The council was baffled. They had never received such a request, had never even heard of the 1847 Act. They responded with confusion, asking for clarification, seeking legal advice, trying to find some way to deny the request without admitting that they didn't understand it. David was patient. He responded to each query with citations from the Act, pointing out that the law was clear and that failure to comply could result in legal action. He gave them deadlines and followed up with letters. 3 months later, the council capitulated. It was a minor victory, but a victory nonetheless. David had forced a public authority to comply with a law that had been forgotten for over a century. He had proven that the system could be made to work, if only someone was willing to push hard enough. Now all he needed was to find something useful in the records. He spent a week in the council archives, a dusty basement beneath the town hall where the records had been stored for decades. It was cold and damp, and the fluorescent lights flickered constantly, casting everything in a sickly yellowish glow. But David didn't notice any of that. He was focused entirely on the documents in front of him, thousands of pages of records that had been gathering dust for years. He was looking for something specific, a record of the streetlight that had been broken in the alley where Emily had been attacked. He wanted to know why it had been broken, why it had taken so long to repair, and whether anyone had reported it before the attack. The records were chaotic, poorly organized, and incomplete. But David was patient. He went through each file carefully, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a picture of the council's maintenance practices. And then he found it. It was a single sheet of paper, tucked into a file that had been marked miscellaneous and forgotten. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. It was a memo from the council's street lighting department to the security firm that managed their cameras. The memo was brief and terse, barely a paragraph long. The camera on Devonshire Road is to be removed immediately. Authorization, AJ. David read the memo 3 times, his heart pounding in his chest. Devonshire Road was the street that led to the alley where Emily had been attacked. The camera that had been removed was one of the few that might have captured the attack. And it had been removed 2 days before the attack. David sat back in his chair, staring at the memo. It was a piece of paper, nothing more. But it was a piece of paper that should not have existed. The camera had been removed deliberately, by someone in authority, and the removal had been concealed. Someone had known about the attack before it happened. Someone had made sure that there would be no evidence. David's hands began to tremble. It wasn't fear, it was rage. Pure, incandescent rage that threatened to consume him. He had known, of course. He had suspected that something was wrong with the investigation, that someone had been interfering with the search for the truth. But this was proof. Concrete, undeniable proof that the attack on his daughter had been planned, that Emily had been targeted, that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the perpetrator would never be caught. The memo was signed AJ. David had no idea who that was, but he would find out. He would tear the council apart if he had to, follow every lead, expose every secret. He photocopied the memo and returned the original to the file. He wouldn't tip his hand, not yet. He needed to gather more information, build a case, prepare for the battle that was coming. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The attack on Emily was not a random mugging. It was part of something larger, something that involved people with power and influence, people who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. And David would stop at nothing to stop them. Chapter 4. The Quiet Desperation. The months that followed the attack were the darkest of David Mercer's life. He had always been a man of order and routine, someone who believed that hard work and persistence could overcome any obstacle. He had built his career on that belief, had raised his daughter with that belief, had navigated the death of his wife with that belief. But now, for the first time in his life, he found himself adrift. The foundations that had always supported him, his work, his faith in the system, his sense of purpose, had crumbled beneath him. He was left with nothing but the cold, hard certainty that he had failed his daughter in the worst possible way. Emily had moved back home after her discharge from the hospital. David had set up her old room with all the comforts he could think of, fresh sheets, her favorite books, a television that he hoped would distract her from her thoughts. He had stocked the kitchen with her favorite foods, had arranged for a therapist to visit twice a week, had done everything he could think of to make her recovery easier. Nothing worked. Emily withdrew into herself, retreating into a shell of silence and stillness that David found almost unbearable. She rarely spoke, rarely ate, rarely left her room. When she did emerge, it was with a hollow look in her eyes that made David's heart ache. She had been such a vibrant girl before the attack. Her laugh had filled their home. Her smile had brightened even the greyest of London days. She had been passionate about her art, spending hours in her room with her paints and canvases, creating worlds of colour and light that seemed to exist outside the confines of their modest house. Now she was a ghost, haunting the halls of their home with a quiet desperation that David could not alleviate. He tried everything he could think of. He sat with her for hours, holding her hand, speaking in soft, soothing tones. He read to her from her favourite books, played her favourite music, showed her pictures of happier times. He encouraged her to paint, to draw, to do anything that might bring back some spark of the person she had been. Nothing worked. The therapist told him to be patient, to give Emily time to process what had happened. She said that the psychological wounds of such an attack took months, even years, to heal. She prescribed medication to help with the anxiety and depression, and she recommended that David be supportive without being overbearing. David nodded and smiled and said all the right things. But inside, he was screaming. He was a man of action, someone who had always believed that problems could be solved with hard work and determination. But there was no action he could take to heal his daughter. He could not fight the demons that haunted her, could not banish the memories that tormented her. He could only sit by helplessly and watch as she faded away. The nights were the worst. Emily's nightmares were so vivid that she often woke screaming, convinced that her attacker was in the room with her. David would rush to her side, holding her tightly, speaking in low, soothing tones until her screams subsided into quiet sobs. "Dad, he's going to find me," she would whisper, her voice trembling with fear. "He knows where I live. He's going to come back."
No, Emily.
"No one is going to hurt you. I promise." But the promises felt hollow, meaningless. He had promised to protect her before, and he had failed. What good were his words now? The nightmares continued, night after night, wearing down both Emily and David. He began to sleep in a chair outside her room, just in case she needed him. He barely slept, barely ate, barely functioned. His law practice, which he had continued to run from home after his resignation, began to suffer. He cancelled appointments, ignored calls, let deadlines pass. His clients, once the focus of his professional life, became an inconvenience, a distraction from the only thing that mattered. His partners called, concerned about his well-being. They didn't understand what was happening, why he had withdrawn so completely from the life he had built. David fobbed them off with excuses, promised to return to work soon, to take on the cases that were waiting for him. He never did. He had no interest in the small disputes and petty grievances that had once consumed his professional life. His focus was entirely on Emily, on finding the man who had hurt her, on bringing him to justice. But the justice system had failed him. The police had given up, the Crown Prosecution Service had washed its hands of the case, and the man who had attacked his daughter was still out there, free to hurt someone else. The thought made David sick with rage. He had spent his life believing in the law, trusting that it would find the truth and deliver justice. Now he knew that the law was just another tool, a weapon that could be used by those with power and influence to protect themselves from accountability. But the law could also be used by those who were willing to fight for it. David had spent his career mastering the arcane details of the legal system, learning its secrets, understanding its strengths and weaknesses. He had used that knowledge to win cases for his clients, to help them navigate the complexities of the law. Now he would use it to find the truth. He began to work on the case in earnest, devoting every waking hour to the search for answers. He pored over the police file, noting every discrepancy, every inconsistency. He tracked down witnesses, interviewed them himself, compared their statements to what they had told the police. He found discrepancies. Small at first, then larger. Witnesses who had changed their stories, who had become suddenly uncooperative, who had been pressured to forget what they had seen. He found connections. A local businessman who had been seen in the area on the night of the attack, who had a history of violence, who had the resources to buy silence and influence. He found a pattern. The attack on Emily was not random. It was part of something larger, something that involved people with power and money, people who had been protected by the very system that was supposed to punish them. The more David found, the more obsessed he became. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped leaving his study. He was consumed by the case, driven by a rage that was cold and implacable and utterly consuming. His health began to suffer. He lost weight, his skin took on a greyish pallor, his eyes became sunken and haunted. He looked like a man possessed, driven by forces beyond his control. His daughter noticed. Emily, who had been so withdrawn from the world, began to emerge from her shell, worried about her father. "Dad, you need to take care of yourself." She stood in the doorway of his study, her arms wrapped around her thin frame. "You're not sleeping, you're not eating. You're going to make yourself sick."
I'm fine, Emily.
"I'm just working on something important." "Are you working on my case?" Her voice was small, uncertain. David looked up, meeting her gaze. There was something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in months. Concern, not for herself, but for him. It was a small thing, a tiny spark of the person she had been, but it gave him hope. "Yes," he said. "I'm working on your case. I'm going to find the man who hurt you, Emily. I'm going to make sure that he pays for what he did." Emily was silent for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face. Then she stepped forward, crossing the room to where he sat, and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. "I don't care about that, Dad," she whispered. "I just want you back. I want my father back." David felt something crack inside him, the carefully constructed wall of rage and determination that had sustained him through the darkest days of his life. He pulled Emily close, holding her tightly, feeling her tears on his cheek. "I'm here, Em," he said. "I'm right here. I'm never going to leave you." "But you're not here." She pulled back, looking at him with eyes that were too old for her young face. "You're here physically, but you're not here. You're lost in this thing, this obsession. You're not my father anymore." The words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He had been so consumed by the search for justice, so driven by his need to find the truth, that he had lost sight of the one person who mattered most. He had abandoned Emily, not physically, but emotionally, leaving her to struggle alone while he pursued his vendetta. He had become the very thing he had always despised, a man so consumed by his own agenda that he had forgotten his responsibility to those who depended on him. "Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "I know, Dad." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I know you're trying to help me. But you're not helping. You're just making things worse." David pulled her close again, holding her as she wept. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life. The next day, he made a decision. He would not abandon his search for the truth. He would not give up on finding the man who had attacked his daughter. But he would not let his obsession consume him, would not let it destroy the relationship that mattered most to him. He would find a way to balance his responsibilities, to be both a father and an avenger. It was a dangerous path, one that could easily lead to disaster. But it was the only path he had. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Tool. The discovery of the 1847 Act was a revelation. David had been searching for something, anything that might give him an advantage in his quest for justice. He had read through dozens of statutes, hundreds of legal texts, thousands of pages of case law. He had followed every lead, chased every possibility, left no stone unturned. And then, in the dusty pages of his grandfather's law library, he had found it. The 1847 Municipal Corporations Act was a relic of a bygone era, a piece of legislation that had been written at a time when the legal system was vastly different from what it was today. It had been passed to regulate the powers of municipal corporations, to ensure that they were accountable to the citizens they served. Most of the act had been superseded by subsequent legislation, rendered obsolete by the passage of time and the evolution of the legal system. But one provision had never been formally repealed. It was a small thing, a single clause buried in the middle of the act, but it had the power to change everything. The records of every municipal corporation, it read, shall be open to inspection by any ratepayer of such corporation, at all reasonable times, without payment of any fee. It was a simple provision, written in the plain language of an earlier age. It had been designed to ensure that citizens could hold their local government accountable, to prevent the kind of corruption and cronyism that had plagued the municipal corporations of the 19th century. And it had never been repealed. David read the clause 3 times, his heart pounding in his chest. The implications were staggering. Under this provision, he could demand access to any records held by the local council, including those that would normally be exempt under the Freedom of Information Act. He knew that the council would fight him. They would argue that the act had been superseded, that the provision was obsolete, that he had no right to the information he was seeking. But the law was on his side. The 1847 Act was still on the statute books, still technically in force. The council could argue all they wanted, but they couldn't change the law. David began to smile. It was a cold smile, the smile of a man who had just discovered a weapon that no one else knew existed. He spent the next week preparing his request. He researched the Act thoroughly, tracking down every subsequent piece of legislation that might have affected it. He found that while much of the Act had been repealed, the provision regarding records had never been touched. It was still valid, still enforceable, still a powerful tool for anyone who knew how to use it. He drafted his request carefully, using the precise language of the Act. He requested access to all records held by the council related to the maintenance of street lighting in the area where Emily had been attacked. He included the date range, the specific location, everything that would make his request difficult to deny. He sent the request to the council's legal department, knowing that they would be baffled by the ancient statute he was invoking. He included a copy of the Act, highlighted the relevant provision, and attached a letter explaining his rights under the law. The response came within a week. The council's legal team had clearly been scrambling, trying to find some way to deny his request. They had failed. Your request under the 1847 Act is acknowledged, the letter read. However, we must inform you that the provision you cite has been superseded by subsequent legislation, including the Freedom of Information Act 2000. Your request is therefore denied. David had expected this. He had prepared for this. He responded immediately, citing a 1932 Court of Appeal decision that had confirmed the continuing validity of the 1847 Act's provisions. He pointed out that the Freedom of Information Act contained an explicit provision stating that it did not affect any other right of access to information. The 1847 Act remains in force, he wrote. Your denial is unlawful. I am giving you 7 days to comply with my request. If you do not, I will seek a court order compelling your compliance. The letter was aggressive, confrontational, and entirely within the bounds of the law. David knew that the council would not want to fight this battle, not when the law was so clearly on his side. He was right. A week later, he received a letter from the council's legal department, informing him that his request had been approved. He would be given access to the records, subject to certain conditions. He was to report to the council archives at a specified time, and he would be supervised during his inspection. David grinned. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He had forced a public authority to comply with a law that had been forgotten for over a century. He had proven that the system could be made to work, if only someone was willing to push hard enough. Now all he needed was to find something useful in the records. The council archives were located in the basement of the town hall, a vast, dusty space that had been used for document storage for decades. The records were poorly organized, often incomplete, and in many cases, barely legible. But David was patient. He went through each file carefully, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a picture of the council's maintenance practices. He was looking for something specific, a record of the streetlight that had been broken in the alley where Emily had been attacked. He found it on the 3rd day of his search. It was a single sheet of paper, tucked into a file that had been marked miscellaneous and forgotten. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. It was a memo from the council's street lighting department to the security firm that managed their cameras. The memo was brief and terse, barely a paragraph long. The camera on Devonshire Road is to be removed immediately. Authorization, AJ. David read the memo 3 times, his hands trembling. Devonshire Road was the street that led to the alley where Emily had been attacked. The camera that had been removed was one of the few that might have captured the attack. And it had been removed 2 days before the attack. He sat back in his chair, staring at the memo. It was a piece of paper, nothing more. But it was a piece of paper that should not have existed. The camera had been removed deliberately, by someone in authority, and the removal had been concealed. Someone had known about the attack before it happened. Someone had made sure that there would be no evidence. David's hands began to shake. It wasn't fear, it was rage. Pure, incandescent rage that threatened to consume him. He had known, of course. He had suspected that something was wrong with the investigation, that someone had been interfering with the search for the truth. But this was proof. Concrete, undeniable proof that the attack on his daughter had been planned, that Emily had been targeted, that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the perpetrator would never be caught. The memo was signed AJ. David had no idea who that was, but he would find out. He would tear the council apart if he had to, follow every lead, expose every secret. He photocopied the memo and returned the original to the file. He wouldn't tip his hand, not yet. He needed to gather more information, build a case, prepare for the battle that was coming. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The attack on Emily was not a random mugging. It was part of something larger, something that involved people with power and influence, people who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. And David would stop at nothing to stop them. He left the archives that afternoon, the photocopied memo safely hidden in his briefcase. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the street. David stood on the pavement, looking up at the town hall, a grim smile on his face. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 6. The Whistleblower. The name AJ haunted David Mercer's thoughts for days. He had photocopied the memo, tucked it safely away in his study, and stared at it for hours. The initials were maddeningly vague. They could belong to anyone, a council employee, a security contractor, a politician. Without more information, he was chasing shadows. But David had spent his career following paper trails, and he knew that every document left a trace. The memo had been written on council letterhead, which meant it had originated in the street lighting department. The authorization had come from someone with enough authority to order the removal of a security camera without going through the proper channels. That narrowed the field considerably. David began his investigation methodically, the way he had approached every case in his legal career. He requested the personnel records of the street lighting department under the 1847 Act, which he had already proven was still enforceable. He cross-referenced the initials with the list of employees, looking for anyone whose name matched. There were 3 possible candidates: Alan James, a senior engineer who had been with the council for 20 years, Andrew Jenkins, a mid-level manager who had been hired 5 years ago, and Amanda Johnson, the department's administrative assistant. David focused on Alan James. The senior engineer had been with the council long enough to have the kind of authority that the memo implied. He had also been the subject of several complaints about his management style, complaints that had been quietly buried by the council's Human Resources Department. He tracked down James's address through the electoral roll, a public record that was available to anyone who knew how to access it. The address was a small flat in a run-down part of Hammersmith, far from the comfortable suburban home that a senior council employee should have been able to afford. The discrepancy made David suspicious. He started digging deeper, looking into James's financial history, his career trajectory, his personal life. What he found was a man who had been systematically destroyed. Alan James had been a rising star in the council's engineering department. He had been responsible for the installation of the CCTV cameras that had been rolled out across the borough, a project that had earned him praise from his superiors and recognition from his peers. Then, 5 years ago, everything had changed. James had been transferred to a dead-end position in the street lighting department, a demotion that had effectively ended his career. His performance reviews had suddenly become negative, filled with criticisms that had never been mentioned before. He had been passed over for promotions, denied training opportunities, frozen out of the projects that had once been his responsibility. And then, 2 years ago, he had been fired. The official reason was redundancy, but David knew better. Redundancy was a convenient excuse for getting rid of employees who knew too much, who had seen things they weren't supposed to see. David found James's phone number and called him. "I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name," James said, his voice guarded. "My name is David Mercer. I'm a solicitor. I'm investigating an attack on my daughter, and I believe you might have information that could help." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David waited, patient, knowing that he was walking a fine line. If he pushed too hard, James would hang up and never speak to him again. If he didn't push hard enough, he might never get the information he needed. "I don't know anything about any attack," James said finally. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Please, Mr. James. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I just want to know what happened to the camera on Devonshire Road. I know it was removed 2 days before my daughter was attacked. I know you were involved." The silence stretched out, long and agonizing. David could hear James breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel the man's fear and uncertainty. "I can't talk about this," James said finally. "They'll destroy me. They've already destroyed me. I lost my job, my pension, my reputation. I have nothing left. I can protect you, Mr. James. I'm a solicitor. I know how to keep things confidential. I just need to know the truth. I need to think about this. Give me a few days." "Of course. But please, don't take too long. Every day that passes is another day that my daughter's attacker remains free." James promised to call back, but days passed and there was no word from him. David called again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He left messages, but they were never returned. He began to worry that James had been scared off, that someone had gotten to him before David could. The thought made him sick with frustration. He was so close to the truth, and yet it was slipping away from him. 3 weeks passed, and David had almost given up hope. Then, late one night, his phone rang. "Mr. Mercer? This is Alan James." David's heart leaped. "Thank you for calling, Mr. James. I was starting to worry. I am sorry. I needed to be sure. I needed to know I could trust you." "You can trust me. I promise you that. I know who took down the camera, and I know why." James's voice was low, barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid of being overheard. It was Julian Croft. He's a city councillor, a property developer. He's the one who had me transferred, who ruined my career. Julian Croft. I know the name. He's one of the most powerful men in the borough. He's more than powerful. He's dangerous. He owns half the council, the police commissioner, half the judges in the area. He's untouchable. Tell me what you know, Mr. James. Everything. James took a deep breath, and then the story came pouring out. He had been the engineer responsible for the CCTV cameras, the one who had installed them and maintained them. He had noticed that the cameras in certain areas kept breaking down, that the footage was often lost or corrupted. He had investigated, and what he found had shocked him. The cameras were being tampered with deliberately, sabotaged to ensure that they couldn't capture certain events. The sabotage was being coordinated by a security firm that was owned by Julian Croft. "I documented everything," James said. "I had photos, reports, evidence that Croft was using the cameras to protect his criminal enterprises. I was going to go to the police, but before I could, I was transferred. They took away my responsibilities, my authority, everything. And then they fired me." "Why didn't you go to the police after you were fired?" "Because Croft threatened me. He said he would destroy me if I said anything. And he was right. He's already destroyed my career. If I spoke out, he would destroy my life. I have a wife, children. I couldn't risk it." David felt a surge of anger, not at James, but at the system that had failed him. This man had tried to do the right thing, and he had been punished for it. He had been silenced, broken, reduced to a shell of his former self. "I need to see that evidence," David said. "The photos, the reports. I need to know what you found." "I don't have them anymore. Croft's people took them when they fired me. They went through my office, my computer, everything. They took it all." David's heart sank. "You have nothing." "I have my memory. I remember what I saw. And I can tell you who was involved, what they did, how they did it." "You'll need to testify. You'll need to go public." "I can't. I told you. I know what Croft threatened you with. But listen to me, Mr. James. I have a daughter who was attacked, who was left for dead in a dark alley. I have evidence that her attacker was protected by people like Croft. I have evidence that the attack was planned, that someone made sure there would be no evidence. I'm not asking you to risk your life. I'm asking you to help me bring these people to justice. I'm asking you to do the right thing." James was silent for a long moment. David could hear him breathing, could almost feel the man's internal struggle. "Okay," James said finally. "Okay. I'll help you. But I want your word that you'll protect my identity. I can't let my family be hurt because of me. You have my word, Mr. James. I will protect you. I will keep your identity secret as long as possible. And when the time comes, I will make sure you have the best legal representation money can buy. I hope you're right, Mr. Mercer. Because if you're wrong, I'm a dead man. They arranged to meet the next day, at a cafe in a part of London where no one would recognize either of them. David arrived early, ordered a cup of tea, and waited. James was late. David began to worry, to fear that he had been scared off, that someone had gotten to him. But then the cafe door opened, and a thin, nervous man walked in. He was in his late 50s, with grey hair and haunted eyes, wearing a cheap coat that looked too thin for the weather. Mr. Mercer. James approached the table, his hand extended. Mr. James. Thank you for coming. They shook hands, and James sat down across from him. Up close, the man looked even more broken. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted around the cafe, as if he expected to be attacked at any moment. I don't have much time, James said. I shouldn't even be here. I understand. Just tell me what you know, and I'll take it from there. James nodded. Then he began to talk. Chapter 7. The Journalist. Sarah Harding had been a journalist for 15 years, and she had seen just about everything. She had covered wars, natural disasters, political scandals, corporate malfeasance. She had been threatened, harassed, sued, and physically attacked. She had lost jobs, friends, and relationships because of her work. But she had never given up. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with sharp features and sharper eyes. Her hair was a wild tumble of dark curls that she had long ago stopped trying to tame, and her clothes were perpetually rumpled, the uniform of someone who spent more time chasing stories than worrying about appearances. She worked for the Fourth Estate, a small online outlet that had been founded by a group of journalists who had grown tired of the corporate media's reluctance to tackle difficult stories. They had no money, no influence, and no political backing. What they had was a fierce commitment to the truth and a willingness to go where other journalists feared to tread. Sarah had been one of the founding members, and she had been with the outlet for 5 years. In that time, she had broken stories that had brought down politicians, exposed corporate corruption, and given voice to the voiceless. She was good at what she did, and she knew it. But even she was skeptical when David Mercer called her. I have a story for you, he said. One of the biggest stories you'll ever cover. I've heard that before, she replied, not unkindly. What makes this one different? Because it involves corruption at the highest levels of government, a cover-up of a brutal crime, and the systematic destruction of anyone who tries to speak the truth. And I have evidence. Real evidence, not just speculation. Sarah was intrigued. She had learned to trust her instincts, and something about the man's voice, his quiet intensity, told her that this was not just another crackpot with a conspiracy theory. Tell me more, she said. David told her everything. He told her about Emily, about the attack, about the police investigation that had gone nowhere. He told her about the 1847 Act, the memo he had found, the CCTV camera that had been removed 2 days before the attack. He told her about Alan James, the whistleblower who had been destroyed by Julian Croft. You're talking about one of the most powerful men in London, Sarah said when he had finished. Croft has connections everywhere. He's been investigated before, and nothing has ever stuck. I know. That's why I need your help. I can't fight him alone. I need someone to tell the story, to expose the truth to the public. And what do you get out of this? Revenge? No. David's voice was firm. Justice. I want to see the man who attacked my daughter brought to justice. I want to see the people who protected him held accountable. That's all I want. Sarah was silent for a moment. She had been burned before, had trusted sources who had turned out to be less than honest. But something about David Mercer's story rang true. It had the ring of authenticity, the details that only someone who had lived through the experience could know. Send me the evidence, she said finally. Everything you have. I'll look into it. David sent her a package the next day. It contained copies of the memo, the council records, the notes from his interviews with Alan James. It also contained a detailed timeline of events, a list of potential witnesses, and a summary of the legal strategies he was pursuing. Sarah spent a week going through the material, cross-referencing it with her own sources, checking the facts and figures. What she found was damning. Julian Croft was not just a corrupt politician. He was a criminal, a man who had built an empire on the backs of the vulnerable, who had used his power and influence to destroy anyone who threatened him. The pattern was consistent. Anyone who tried to expose Croft's activities was targeted, their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. James was just one of many. There were others, dozens of others, all of whom had been silenced by the same ruthless efficiency. Croft had managed to stay one step ahead of the law for years. He had bribed the right people, made the right connections, played the game with a skill that had made him virtually untouchable. But he had made a mistake. He had attacked Emily Mercer, and he had left a trail of evidence that David had been able to follow. Sarah began to write the story. She was careful, meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. She interviewed witnesses, verified facts, built a case that was tight and unassailable. She also took precautions. Croft had a history of suing journalists who wrote about him, and Sarah knew that she needed to protect herself and her outlet. She consulted with lawyers, made sure that every detail was accurate, every claim supported by evidence. When the story was ready, she published it. The headline was simple: The Untouchable Man, How Julian Croft Used His Power to Cover Up a Brutal Crime. The story was anything but simple. It laid out the full extent of Croft's corruption, the web of bribery and intimidation that had protected him for so long. It named names, cited evidence, told the story of Emily Mercer and the attack that had changed her life forever. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Croft's enemies, and he had many, saw an opportunity to strike. They had been waiting for years for someone to break the story, and now that it had happened, they were determined to capitalize on it. The mainstream media picked up the story, running with it in a way that they had never done before. Suddenly, Croft was front-page news, the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. Croft himself responded with characteristic arrogance. He dismissed the story as a fabrication, a smear campaign by his political enemies. He threatened to sue Sarah and the Fourth Estate, to bankrupt them with legal fees and force them to retract the story. But David was ready for him. He had prepared for this moment, had anticipated Croft's response and built a legal strategy to counter it. "I will defend you," he told Sarah. "I will represent the Fourth Estate pro bono. Croft may have money, but I have the law on my side." Sarah was skeptical. "He has the best lawyers money can buy. How can you compete with that?" "Because I know the law better than they do. I know every trick, every loophole, every weapon that the legal system provides. They may have money, but I have the truth." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding what David was really saying. He wasn't just offering his legal services, he was offering her his life, his time, his entire being. "Okay," she said. "Let's fight." The legal battle began immediately. Croft's lawyers filed a slap suit against the Fourth Estate, claiming defamation and seeking damages. They demanded that the story be taken down, that Sarah retract her claims, that she apologize publicly for the damage she had done to Croft's reputation. David responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing that the story was protected by the public interest and that Croft had failed to demonstrate any actual harm. He cited precedent after precedent, built a case that was meticulous and unassailable. The legal maneuvering went on for weeks, each side trading motions and counter-motions. David spent hours in court, arguing on behalf of Sarah and the Fourth Estate. He was brilliant, relentless, utterly consumed by the case. And slowly, he began to win. The judge ruled in their favor, dismissing Croft's suit and ordering him to pay their legal costs. It was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves through the legal community. Croft was furious. He had never lost a case before, had always been able to use his money and influence to crush his opponents. But this time, he had met his match. David Mercer had become a force to be reckoned with. And the battle had only just begun. Chapter 8. The Hidden Witness. The victory in court was important, but David knew it was only the beginning. He had exposed Croft's corruption, had forced the legal system to acknowledge the truth, but he still didn't have enough evidence to bring criminal charges against anyone. He needed more. He needed witnesses who were willing to testify, documents that would prove Croft's involvement, evidence that would be admissible in court. He focused his attention on Marco Silva, the man who had been identified in the police file as a person of interest. Silva was Croft's nephew, a petty thug with a history of violence. He had been in the area on the night of the attack, and his alibi had been provided by Croft's people. David suspected that Silver was the attacker. He had no proof, not yet, but everything he had uncovered pointed in that direction. The challenge was getting to Silver. He was a ghost, with no known address, no phone number, no presence on social media. He moved through the city like a phantom, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. David began to investigate Silver's movements, using the public records that were available to him. He found that Silver had a history of property crimes, that he had been arrested several times but never convicted. He had a pattern of using the same modus operandi, preying on young women in dark alleys. It was a pattern that matched Emily's attack. David shared his findings with Sarah, who was eager to help. She began to investigate Silver's associates, to build a network of sources who might be able to provide information about his whereabouts. One of those sources was a woman named Maria, a former girlfriend of Silver's who had broken up with him after he had attacked her. She had never reported the attack, too afraid of the consequences, but she had been willing to talk to Sarah. "I know what he did," Maria said. "He told me about it. He was proud of it. He said his uncle would protect him, that no one would ever find out." "He told you about the attack?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. "He didn't give me details. Just said that he had gotten some girl, that his uncle had made sure the police wouldn't investigate. He was bragging about it." "Can you testify about that? Can you tell a court what he told you?" Maria hesitated. "I don't know. I'm afraid of him. Of his uncle. If they find out I talk to you." "We'll protect you," Sarah promised. "We'll keep your identity secret. All you have to do is tell the truth." Maria agreed to talk to David, to tell him everything she knew. It was a small thing, a single testimony, but it could be the key that unlocked the case. David met with Maria in a quiet cafe, the same one where he had met Alan James. She was a young woman, barely in her 20s, with nervous eyes and a scar on her arm that she kept trying to hide. "He told me he was going to do it," Maria said. "He said he had been following her for weeks, watching her, waiting for the right moment. He said his uncle had told him what to do." "His uncle told him what to do?" David leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Julian Croft told him to attack my daughter." "I don't know if he said it directly, but Marco said his uncle had given him the orders. Marco was just following instructions." David felt a surge of anger so intense that he had to close his eyes for a moment. He had suspected, had known that Croft was involved, but to hear it confirmed was something else entirely. "Did he say why?" David asked. "Did he say why his uncle wanted this?"
No.
Maria shook her head. "He just said that his uncle had made it clear that he was to do what he was told, and that he would be rewarded for it." David nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Croft had ordered the attack, had used his nephew as the instrument of his will. But why? What had Emily ever done to him? The answer came later, after Sarah's investigation had uncovered more details. Emily had been walking home from a friend's house, but that friend was no ordinary friend. She had been at the house of the daughter of a journalist who had been investigating Croft's activities. Croft must have thought that Emily was involved with the investigation, that she had information that could hurt him. He had ordered the attack as a warning, a message to anyone who might be thinking of crossing him. It was a chilling realization, one that made David sick with rage. His daughter had been attacked not because of anything she had done, but because of who she knew. She had been targeted as a message, a victim of a man's ruthless ambition. David shared his findings with the police, hoping that they would reopen the investigation. But the police were still reluctant to act. Croft had too many friends in the force, too many people who were willing to look the other way. "It doesn't matter," Sarah said. "We have enough for a story. We can go public, force the police to act." "We don't have enough for a criminal case," David replied. "We need more, something that will stand up in court. Then we find it. We keep digging." They continued their investigation, following every lead, chasing every thread. They interviewed dozens of people, built a network of sources that stretched across the city. They were relentless, driven by a determination that would not be denied. Chapter 9. The Financial Disclosure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a financial disclosure form that had been filed by Croft's company. David had been investigating Croft's finances for months, looking for any evidence of wrongdoing that could be used against him. He had combed through public records, corporate filings, tax returns. He had followed the money, tracing the flow of funds through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. The disclosure form was a routine filing, the kind that companies are required to submit to the government. It listed the company's assets, its liabilities, its shareholders. It was dry, technical, unremarkable. But David noticed something odd. One of the company's major shareholders was a subsidiary that had been set up in the Cayman Islands. The subsidiary owned a significant portion of the company, which meant that the real owners were effectively hidden from view. David began to investigate the subsidiary. He traced its ownership through multiple layers of corporate entities, following the trail of paper that led from one shell company to another. It was tedious work, months of effort, but eventually he found what he was looking for. The subsidiary was owned by a trust, and the trust's beneficiaries were Marco Silva and his mother. Croft had been funneling money to his nephew through a complex web of corporate entities, hiding the payments from the tax authorities and from anyone who might be investigating his activities. David shared his findings with the tax authorities, who were immediately interested. Tax evasion was a serious crime, one that carried heavy penalties. If Croft had been hiding income from the government, he could face years in prison. The tax authorities opened an investigation into Croft's finances, using the evidence that David had provided. They began to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of Croft's financial crimes. It wasn't long before they found more. Croft had been involved in a massive tax fraud scheme, one that had been going on for years. He had used the same shell companies to hide income from the government, to avoid paying taxes on the profits from his business empire. The evidence was overwhelming. Croft had been systematically defrauding the government, stealing from the very people who had put him in power. The tax authorities referred the case to the Serious Fraud Office, which began its own investigation. The SFO had been looking at Croft for years, but had never been able to build a case against him. Now, with the evidence that David had uncovered, they had the smoking gun they needed. Croft's empire began to crumble. His business associates, afraid of being implicated in the fraud, began to distance themselves from him. His political allies, worried about their own reputations, started to fade away. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in London was suddenly alone, abandoned by everyone who had once supported him. But David wasn't satisfied. He had exposed Croft's financial crimes, had brought him to the attention of the authorities, but he still hadn't proven that Croft was responsible for the attack on Emily. He needed more. He needed to prove that Croft had ordered the attack, that he had used his nephew as an instrument of his will. He needed to make sure that Emily's attacker was brought to justice. Chapter 10. The Public Record. The final piece of the puzzle came from a public record that David had been overlooking. He had been so focused on the criminal investigation that he had neglected the civil side of things. But a colleague at his old law firm reminded him that he could still file a civil suit on behalf of Emily, a suit that would allow him to use the discovery process to gather evidence. The civil suit was a long shot, but David decided to try. He filed a lawsuit against John Doe, the unknown assailant, seeking damages for the injuries that Emily had suffered. The suit was a legal fiction, a way to force the disclosure of information that would otherwise remain hidden. Croft's lawyers tried to have the suit dismissed, arguing that there was no evidence linking their client to the attack. But David was ready for them. He presented the evidence he had gathered, the memo, the testimony of Alan James and Maria, the financial disclosures. The judge ruled in David's favor, ordering that discovery proceed. Croft's company was required to turn over its records, to provide information that could help identify the true perpetrator of the attack. It was a monumental victory, one that gave David access to the information he needed. He spent weeks going through the discovery documents, cross-referencing them with the evidence he had already gathered. And then he found what he was looking for. It was a series of emails between Croft and his nephew, discussing the attack. The emails were coded, using language that was designed to avoid detection, but their meaning was clear. Croft had ordered the attack, had given his nephew specific instructions on what to do. The emails were the smoking gun that David had been searching for. They proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Croft was responsible for the attack on Emily. David handed the evidence to the police, who were finally forced to act. They arrested Marco Silva and charged him with the assault. They also arrested Julian Croft, charging him with conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, and a host of financial crimes. The arrests were front-page news. Croft, once one of the most powerful men in London, was led away in handcuffs. The man who had thought himself untouchable was finally being held accountable. David watched the coverage on the news, a grim smile on his face. He had done it. He had fought the system and won, had exposed the corruption that had protected his daughter's attacker. But the victory felt hollow. Emily was still scarred, still traumatized by what had happened to her. The justice system had failed her, had allowed her attacker to go free for months. The wounds that had been inflicted on her would never fully heal. Still, there was a measure of satisfaction in knowing that her attacker would finally face justice. It wasn't the perfect outcome, not by a long shot, but it was something. David sat in his study, looking out at the grey London sky, and thought about what came next. The legal battles were over, but the war was just beginning. He had proven that the law could work, if only someone was willing to fight for it. He had shown that the forgotten statutes, the neglected provisions, the hidden weapons of the legal system, could still be used to expose the truth. He would continue his work, would become a voice for those who had been forgotten by the justice system. He would use his legal skills to help others, to ensure that no one else had to suffer the way his daughter had suffered. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 11. The Deposition. The civil suit had been a gamble from the start, a legal Hail Mary that David had launched more out of desperation than strategy. But now, 6 months after the initial filing, it was paying dividends in ways he had never anticipated. The discovery process had been brutal. Croft's legal team had fought every request, challenged every subpoena, delayed every deadline. They had buried David in paperwork, forced him to spend countless hours arguing procedural points before judges who seemed increasingly impatient with the whole affair. But David had persisted. He had used every tool at his disposal, the ancient statutes, the freedom of information requests, the public records that were available to anyone who knew where to look. He had built a case that was meticulous, comprehensive, and utterly damning. Now, finally, it was time for the deposition of Marco Silva. The deposition was being held in a conference room at the offices of Croft's law firm, a gleaming tower in the heart of the city. The room was all glass and chrome, designed to impress and intimidate. David had been there many times before, on the other side of the table, representing clients who were trying to avoid the consequences of their actions. This time, he was the one asking the questions. He had prepared meticulously for this day. He had reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every document that had been produced during discovery. He had anticipated every possible answer, every evasion, every lie. He was ready. Silva was brought into the room by his lawyer, a sleek young man in an expensive suit who looked like he had just graduated from law school. The two men sat down across from David, their expressions carefully neutral. "Mr. Silva," David began, "thank you for agreeing to this deposition."
Silva suggested.
"I have no choice. You forced me to be here." "I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm simply asking you to tell the truth." Silva's lawyer leaned forward. "My client is here to answer questions, Mr. Mercer. He's not here to be lectured." "Of course." David smiled, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's begin." The questions started simple enough. David asked about Silva's employment history, his relationship with his uncle, his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Silva answered each question with a monotone denial, his face expressionless. "I was at home," he said. "I was watching television." "Can anyone confirm that?" "I was alone. I don't need witnesses to prove I was at home." "Actually, Mr. Silva, you do. Your alibi is essential to your defense. Without it, you're a suspect in a violent crime." Silva's lawyer interjected. "My client is not a suspect. He's a witness, answering questions under oath." "I understand that." David's voice was calm, measured. "I'm simply trying to establish the facts." He continued the questioning, slowly building a picture of Silva's movements on the night of the attack. He asked about the car Silva was driving, the clothes he was wearing, the route he had taken. He asked about the phone calls Silva had made, the text messages he had sent. Silva answered each question with the same monotone denial. He remembered nothing. He had done nothing. He was innocent of any crime. But David noticed something. As the questioning continued, Silva's answers became less certain, more hesitant. He was beginning to slip, to make mistakes that a careful observer would notice. "Mr. Silva," David said, leaning forward, "you mentioned earlier that you were at your flat on the night of the attack. Can you describe your flat for me?
Silva Froned.
What does that have to do with anything? I'm trying to establish the facts, Mr. Silva. Please answer the question. Silva glanced at his lawyer, who nodded slightly. It's a small flat. 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a living room. Nothing special. And what color is the front door? Red. No, wait. Blue. It's blue. Which is it, Mr. Silva? Red or blue?
Silva's face flushed.
I don't remember. It's not important. I think it is important, Mr. Silva. If you can't remember the color of your own front door, how can you be sure you were at home on the night of the attack? Silva's lawyer interjected again. Mr. Mercer, this is harassment. My client is doing his best to answer your questions. I'm not harassing him. I'm trying to get to the truth. David turned back to Silva. Mr. Silva, you've told me that you were at home on the night of the attack, but you can't remember the color of your front door. You can't remember what you were watching on television. You can't remember anything that would confirm your alibi. I find that interesting. Because what I do remember is that you were seen in the area where the attack occurred. You were seen driving a car that matches the description of the one that was used in the attack. You were seen by multiple witnesses. Silva's face was pale now, his hands trembling. I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't there. You were there, Mr. Silva. And I have the evidence to prove it. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He opened it, revealing the photographs, the witness statements, the documents that he had gathered over months of investigation. There's no point in lying, Mr. Silva. The truth is going to come out eventually. The only question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Silva stared at the folder, his face a mask of fear. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, but Silva seemed not to hear him. I want a lawyer, Silva said finally. I want to speak to my lawyer. You have a lawyer, Mr. Silva. He's sitting right next to you. I want a different lawyer. I want someone I can trust. David smiled. I'm afraid that's not how it works, Mr. Silva. You're in a deposition, and you're under oath. You can't just stop answering questions. Silva's lawyer stood up. This deposition is over. My client is too distressed to continue. David knew he had won. Silva's lies had been exposed, his alibi destroyed. The deposition was a success. But it was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. Chapter 12. The Second Journalist. The story that Sarah Harding had published had caused a sensation. It had been picked up by newspapers across the country, discussed on television and radio, debated on social media. Julian Croft, who had once seemed untouchable, was now the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. But Sarah knew that the story was only half finished. She had exposed Croft's corruption, had laid out the evidence of his involvement in the attack on Emily Mercer. But she hadn't yet proven the connection between Croft and his nephew, Marco Silva. She hadn't yet shown how Croft had used his power and influence to protect his nephew from prosecution. She needed more. She needed someone on the inside, someone who could provide the details that would make the story irrefutable. That someone turned out to be a young clerk at Croft's accounting firm. Her name was Claire Thompson, and she was 24 years old, a recent graduate who had taken the job because it paid well and offered opportunities for advancement. She had been working at the firm for 2 years, long enough to see things that she shouldn't have seen. She contacted Sarah through a burner phone, using a number that she had found in one of Sarah's articles. She was terrified, her voice trembling, but she was determined to tell the truth. I have evidence, she said. I have documents that prove what Croft has been doing. What kind of documents? Sarah asked, her heart racing. Financial records. Bank statements. Emails. I've been copying them for months, keeping them in a safe place. I was going to go to the police, but I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Sarah made an appointment to meet Claire in a quiet coffee shop in a part of London where neither of them would be recognized. When she arrived, Claire was already there, a thin, nervous young woman with dark circles under her eyes. I don't have much time, Claire said. They'll notice I'm gone. Just tell me what you know, Sarah said. Everything. Claire took a deep breath and began to talk. She told Sarah about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the systematic fraud that had been going on for years. She told her about the payments that had been made to Marco Silva, the money that had been funneled through the complex web of corporate entities. "I have copies of the emails," Claire said. "I have records of the transactions. I have proof that Croft was involved in everything." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. This was the evidence she needed, the smoking gun that would bring Croft down once and for all. "Can you testify?" she asked. "Can you go public with this?" Claire hesitated. "I don't know. I'm afraid of what they'll do to me. Croft has connections everywhere. He could destroy my career, my life." "I'll protect you," Sarah promised. "I'll keep your identity secret. All you have to do is tell the truth." Claire nodded slowly. "Okay. I'll do it. I'll tell the truth." Sarah began to write the second story, using the evidence that Claire had provided. It was a detailed exposé of Croft's financial crimes, a story that would leave no doubt about his guilt. She worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. She checked every fact, verified every detail, made sure that the story was airtight. When it was ready, she published it. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Croft's business empire began to crumble, his associates distancing themselves from him, his political allies abandoning him. The government launched a formal investigation into his activities, and the police reopened the case against Marco Silva. Croft was finally being held accountable for his crimes. The story that Sarah had written was the final nail in his coffin. But Sarah knew that the battle was not over. Croft still had powerful friends, still had resources that he could use to fight back. She needed to keep the pressure on, to make sure that justice was done. She continued to investigate, following every lead, chasing every thread. She interviewed dozens of people, built a network of sources that stretched across the city. She was relentless, driven by a determination that would not be denied. And slowly, she began to uncover the full extent of Croft's corruption. It was a story that would shock the nation, that would bring down one of the most powerful men in London. Chapter 13. The Law of Nuisance. The slap suit that Croft had filed against Sarah and the Fourth Estate had been dismissed, but David knew that Croft would continue to use the legal system to harass and intimidate his opponents. He needed a strategy that would protect Sarah and her outlet, a way to make Croft think twice before launching another attack. He found it in an unexpected place, the Public Nuisance Act of 1936. The act was a relic of a bygone era, a piece of legislation that had been passed to address the problems of urban life in the early 20th century. It had been largely forgotten, superseded by subsequent legislation that was more specific and more comprehensive. But like the 1847 Act, it had never been formally repealed. It was still on the statute books, still technically in force. The Act defined public nuisance broadly, covering any activity that interfered with the public's right to use and enjoy public spaces. It included provisions that allowed citizens to apply to the courts for an order to stop a nuisance, and it gave the courts broad discretion to grant such orders. David saw the potential. If he could frame Croft's slapsuit as a public nuisance, as an interference with the public's right to be informed, he could use the Act to stop him. He filed the application, citing the 1936 Act and arguing that Croft's lawsuit was a deliberate attempt to silence legitimate journalism. He presented evidence of Croft's history of using the legal system to harass his opponents, his pattern of filing slapsuits against anyone who threatened his interests. The case went to court, with Croft's lawyers arguing that the 1936 Act had been superseded and that David's application was without merit. David countered with citations from the Act, pointing out that it had never been formally repealed and that the courts had the power to enforce it. The judge listened to both sides, then issued his ruling. The 1936 Act was still in force, and Croft's slapsuit was indeed a public nuisance. Croft was ordered to cease his harassment and to pay damages to Sarah and the Fourth Estate. It was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves through the legal community. The 1936 Act, which had been forgotten for decades, had suddenly become a powerful tool for protecting free speech. Croft's legal team was furious. They had never encountered anyone like David Mercer, someone who was willing to use every weapon in the legal arsenal to fight for his cause. But David was just getting started. He had discovered a new weapon, one that he could use to protect others from the kind of harassment that Sarah had faced. He began to look for other forgotten statutes, other ancient laws that could be used to fight for justice. He found dozens of them, hidden in the dusty volumes of his grandfather's law library, waiting to be rediscovered. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David was determined to make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 14. The Tax Investigation. The evidence that Claire Thompson had provided was damning. It showed that Croft had been systematically defrauding the government, using his shell companies to hide income from the tax authorities. The amount involved was staggering, millions of pounds that had been stolen from the public purse. David shared the evidence with the tax authorities, who were immediately interested. They had been investigating Croft for years, but had never been able to build a case against him. The evidence that David provided was the smoking gun they needed. The tax authorities opened a formal investigation, using the documents that Claire had provided. They began to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of Croft's financial crimes. What they found was shocking. Croft had been involved in a massive tax fraud scheme, one that had been going on for years. He had used the same shell companies to hide income from the government, to avoid paying taxes on the profits from his business empire. The scheme was complex, involving dozens of companies and hundreds of transactions. But the tax authorities were patient, methodical, and they had the resources to follow the money wherever it led. They traced the flow of funds through the shell companies, through the offshore accounts, through the complex web of corporate entities that Croft had created. They found evidence of fraud, of bribery, of corruption at the highest levels. The investigation took months, but eventually, the tax authorities had enough evidence to bring charges. Croft was arrested and charged with tax evasion, fraud, and money laundering. It was a monumental moment, the culmination of years of effort. Croft, who had once seemed untouchable, was finally being held accountable for his crimes. But David knew that the tax investigation was only part of the story. Croft was still facing charges related to the attack on Emily, still facing the consequences of his actions. The tax investigation was important, but it was not the end. The end would come when Croft was convicted of the crimes he had committed against Emily, when he was forced to answer for the pain he had caused. David was determined to make sure that happened. He would not rest until justice was done. Chapter 15. The Last Straw. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a former employee of Croft's who had been fired for refusing to participate in the fraud. His name was Michael Roberts, and he had been the company's chief financial officer for 5 years. He had been recruited by Croft personally, promised a bright future and a comfortable salary. But Roberts had discovered the fraud almost immediately. He had tried to stop it, to report it to the authorities, but Croft had threatened him. He was told that if he said anything, he would be fired and blacklisted, that no one would ever hire him again. Roberts had stayed quiet, hoping that the situation would resolve itself. But it only got worse. Croft's fraud became more elaborate, more brazen, more destructive. Eventually, Roberts could no longer remain silent. He went to the police and told them everything he knew. He provided documents, emails, financial records that proved Croft's guilt. Croft's reaction was swift and brutal. Roberts was fired, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. He was blacklisted from the industry, unable to find work anywhere. But Roberts had not given up. He had continued to gather evidence, to document Croft's crimes. And when David and Sarah began their investigation, he reached out to them. "I have everything," Roberts said. "I have proof of everything Croft has done. The fraud, the bribery, the attacks on anyone who threatened him. I have it all." David met with Roberts, reviewing the evidence that the man had gathered. It was comprehensive, damning, and it proved beyond any doubt that Croft was guilty of the crimes he had been accused of. David shared the evidence with the police and the tax authorities, who were already investigating Croft. The new evidence was the final straw, the last piece of the puzzle that would bring Croft to justice. The police arrested Croft and charged him with a host of crimes, including conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, fraud, and money laundering. The charges were serious, carrying heavy penalties. Croft's legal team tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. They had no choice but to plead guilty to some of the charges, hoping to reduce the sentences on the others. The trial was a media sensation, covered by every major outlet in the country. Croft, once one of the most powerful men in London, was now a convicted criminal, facing years in prison. David watched the coverage on the news, a grim smile on his face. He had done it. He had fought the system and won, had exposed the corruption that had protected his daughter's attacker. But the victory felt hollow. Emily was still scarred, still traumatized by what had happened to her. The justice system had failed her, had allowed her attacker to go free for months. The wounds that had been inflicted on her would never fully heal. Still, there was a measure of satisfaction in knowing that her attacker would finally face justice. It wasn't the perfect outcome, not by a long shot, but it was something. David sat in his study, looking out at the grey London sky, and thought about what came next. The legal battles were over, but the war was just beginning. He had proven that the law could work, if only someone was willing to fight for it. He had shown that the forgotten statutes, the neglected provisions, the hidden weapons of the legal system, could still be used to expose the truth. He would continue his work, would become a voice for those who had been forgotten by the justice system. He would use his legal skills to help others, to ensure that no one else had to suffer the way his daughter had suffered. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 16. The trial begins. The Old Bailey had seen many trials over the centuries, but few had captured the public imagination quite like the case of the Crown versus Julian Croft and Marco Silva. The ancient courthouse, with its imposing facade and legendary history, was packed to capacity on the first day of the proceedings. Journalists from every major news outlet in the country had descended upon London, their cameras and notepads at the ready, eager to capture every moment of what promised to be the trial of the decade. David Mercer sat in the public gallery, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the dock where his daughter's attacker stood flanked by prison officers. Marco Silva looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had appeared in the depositions, his earlier arrogance replaced by a nervous tension that manifested in the constant drumming of his fingers against the wooden rail. Beside him, Julian Croft sat with an expression of studied indifference, as if he were attending a tedious business meeting rather than facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hair immaculately combed, his posture perfect. Even now, with the evidence stacked against him, he refused to show any sign of weakness. Emily was not in the courtroom. The doctors had advised against it, warning that the stress of the proceedings could trigger a relapse of the trauma she had been struggling to overcome. David had reluctantly agreed, promising his daughter that he would tell her everything that happened, that she would not be kept in the dark. He had been sitting in the gallery for an hour before the proceedings began, watching the lawyers file in, the judge take his seat, the jury file into their box. He had studied each member of the jury carefully, trying to gauge their reactions, their sympathies, their likely verdict. It was a habit he had developed over decades of legal practice, and it served him well now. The prosecution was led by Sir Geoffrey Hamilton, a silver-haired barrister with a reputation for ruthlessness and an almost pathological dedication to his cases. He was the kind of lawyer who left no stone unturned, who pursued every lead, who would stop at nothing to secure a conviction. David had crossed swords with him before, and he knew that Croft's legal team was in for a difficult fight. The defense was led by Lord Peter Ashworth, a barrister of equal reputation and skill, known for his ability to find the cracks in even the strongest prosecution case. He was a man who had defended some of the most notorious criminals in British history, and he had an almost unblemished record of success. David watched as the two legal titans faced off across the courtroom, each sizing up the other, preparing for the battle that was about to begin. The prosecution opened with a statement that was as damning as it was concise. Sir Geoffrey laid out the case against Croft and Silva, detailing the attack on Emily Mercer, the cover-up that had followed, and the financial crimes that had been uncovered during the investigation. "The evidence will show," Sir Geoffrey said, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "that the defendants conspired together to commit a brutal crime against an innocent young woman, and that they used their wealth and influence to obstruct the course of justice. The evidence will show that they engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud and corruption, stealing from the public purse and destroying anyone who threatened to expose them. The evidence will show that Julian Croft, a man who held public office and was entrusted with the welfare of the community, used his position to protect his nephew, Marco Silva, from the consequences of his actions. The evidence will show that Croft used his power to intimidate witnesses, to destroy evidence, and to pervert the course of justice. The evidence will show that these men are guilty of the crimes they have been charged with, and I ask you, members of the jury, to return a verdict that reflects the gravity of their actions." The courtroom was silent as Sir Geoffrey took his seat. David felt a surge of hope, a belief that justice was finally being done. The prosecution had laid out its case clearly and compellingly. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no way that Croft and Silva could escape conviction. But David knew that the trial was far from over. Ashworth was a master of the courtroom, a man who could turn even the most damning evidence into something that seemed almost innocent. He would fight every step of the way, exploiting every weakness in the prosecution's case, sowing doubt in the minds of the jury. The trial proceeded with the prosecution calling its first witnesses. Alan James took the stand, his voice trembling slightly as he described how he had been forced to remove the CCTV camera on Devonshire Road, how he had been threatened and intimidated by Crofts' people. "I didn't want to do it," James said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I knew it was wrong. But I was afraid. They told me what would happen if I didn't cooperate." "Who told you?" Sir Geoffrey asked. "Who gave you the orders?" "Mr. Croft. He called me personally. He said that I had to do what I was told, or I would regret it. He said he had friends in the council, friends who could make my life very difficult." The courtroom buzzed with whispered commentary. James's testimony was powerful, damning, and it was only the beginning. Claire Thompson took the stand next, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. She described her work at Crofts' accounting firm, the documents she had discovered, the evidence of the fraud that had been going on for years. "I found emails," she said. "I found bank statements. I found evidence of payments being made to shell companies, to offshore accounts. It was a system of fraud that had been going on for years, and Mr. Croft was at the center of it." She described the pressure she had been under, the threats that had been made against her. She described the moment she had decided to copy the documents, to bring them to a journalist who could expose the truth. The courtroom was silent as she finished her testimony. David could see the faces of the jury, their expressions shifting from skepticism to belief. The evidence was building, mounting, becoming impossible to ignore. But Ashworth was patient. He cross-examined each witness carefully, probing for weaknesses, searching for cracks in their stories. He suggested that James had fabricated his testimony out of revenge, that Thompson had been motivated by a desire for publicity. He cast doubt on the evidence, suggested that it had been manufactured, that the witnesses could not be trusted. David watched the cross-examinations carefully, his legal mind cataloguing each strategy, each tactic. He knew that Ashworth was doing his job, defending his clients with the skills that had made him one of the most respected barristers in the country. But he also knew that the evidence was too strong, too consistent, too damning. The first week of the trial ended with the prosecution still presenting its case. David had been in the gallery every day, watching the proceedings unfold, his heart aching with every detail of the attack on Emily that was revealed. He had spoken to Emily every night, telling her what had happened, answering her questions as honestly as he could. She had listened quietly, her eyes filled with a sadness that broke his heart. "Will they be convicted?" she asked one night, her voice small and uncertain. "I believe so," David said. "The evidence is overwhelming. They're going to pay for what they did to you." Emily was silent for a long moment. "I just want it to be over," she said finally. "I want to move on with my life. I want to forget about all of this." David reached out and took her hand. "I know, Em. I know. And it will be over soon. I promise." But even as he said the words, he knew that the trial was only the beginning. The legal battles were over, but the war was just beginning. The attack on Emily had left scars that would never fully heal, and the memories would haunt her for the rest of her life. He would do everything he could to help her, to support her, to give her the strength she needed to rebuild her life. But he knew that there was only so much he could do. The rest would have to come from within. The second week of the trial began with the prosecution calling its star witness, Marco Silva. The courtroom was packed to capacity as Silva was led to the witness stand. He had been offered a deal by the prosecution, a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against his uncle. It was a deal that he had accepted, and now he was about to tell the world everything he knew. Sir Geoffrey began the questioning gently, establishing Silva's relationship with his uncle, his role in the family business, his knowledge of Croft's activities. "Tell us, Mr. Silva," Sir Geoffrey said. "What did your uncle ask you to do?" Silva took a deep breath. "He asked me to attack a young woman," he said, his voice barely audible. "He said that she was a threat, that she had information that could hurt him. He said that I had to send a message." "Send a message?" Sir Geoffrey asked. "What kind of message?" "That no one could cross him. That anyone who tried would be punished. He said that the girl had to be taught a lesson, that she had to understand the consequences of getting involved in his business." The courtroom was silent as Silva described the attack, the planning, the execution. He described how he had followed Emily for weeks, learning her routine, waiting for the right moment. He described the night of the attack, the dark alley, the violence that had followed. "I didn't want to do it," Silver said, his voice breaking. But my uncle told me that I had no choice. He said that if I didn't do what he told me, he would destroy me. He said that he would ruin my life, that he would make sure that I spent the rest of my life in prison. The courtroom was filled with gasps and whispers. Silver's testimony was devastating, and it was clear that he was telling the truth. Ashworth Cross examined Silver, trying to paint him as a liar, a manipulator, someone who was trying to save himself by blaming his uncle. "You're a criminal, Mr. Silver," Ashworth said. "You have a history of violence. You've been arrested multiple times. Why should the jury believe anything you say?" "Because I'm telling the truth," Silver replied, his voice steady. "I've done terrible things, but I'm trying to make things right. I'm trying to tell the truth for the first time in my life." Ashworth pressed on, trying to break Silver's testimony, but Silver held firm. He had accepted his fate, accepted that he was going to prison, and he was determined to do the right thing for the first time in his life. The trial continued for another 2 weeks, with each witness adding to the growing mountain of evidence against Croft and Silver. By the time the prosecution rested its case, it was clear that the defendants were guilty of the crimes they had been charged with. But the trial was not over. Ashworth had one more strategy to employ, one last attempt to save his clients from conviction. Chapter 17. The Defence's Gambit. Lord Peter Ashworth had been practicing law for 40 years, and he had never lost a case that he truly believed in. He was a man of principle, someone who believed that everyone deserved a defense, no matter how guilty they might appear. He had defended murderers, fraudsters, and even the occasional terrorist, and he had always done so with the same commitment to his clients that he had shown from the very first case of his career. The case of Julian Croft was different. Ashworth knew, deep in his heart, that his client was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony of the witnesses compelling, the case against Croft virtually unassailable. But Ashworth was a professional, and he would do everything in his power to secure the best possible outcome for his client. That was his job, his duty, his obligation. He began his defense with a strategy that was both audacious and risky. He would attack the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, casting doubt on their testimony and suggesting that they had been motivated by personal vendettas rather than a desire for justice. Alan James was the first target. Ashworth Cross examined him relentlessly, suggesting that he had fabricated his testimony out of revenge for being fired from the council. "Mr. James, isn't it true that you were dismissed from your position for incompetence?" Ashworth asked. "Isn't it true that you were a poor employee, that you had a history of problems with your superiors?" "That's not true," James replied, his voice trembling. "I was a good employee. I was fired because I refused to go along with Mr. Croft's schemes." "Are you saying that Mr. Croft had you fired?" Ashworth asked. "Are you saying that he orchestrated your dismissal?" "I'm saying that he forced me out. He made my life a living hell until I had no choice but to leave." Ashworth pressed on, trying to break James's testimony, but the former engineer held firm. He had nothing to lose, and he was determined to tell the truth. Claire Thompson was next, and Ashworth's attack on her credibility was even more brutal. He suggested that she had fabricated her testimony out of a desire for publicity, that she had been looking for a way to make a name for herself. "Miss Thompson, isn't it true that you contacted the press before you contacted the police?" Ashworth asked. "Isn't it true that you were looking for a way to make a name for yourself?" "That's not true," Claire replied, her voice steady. "I contacted the press because I didn't trust the police. I had heard stories about Mr. Croft's influence, and I knew that I needed to go public to protect myself." "I see." Ashworth's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "So you were protecting yourself. You weren't trying to profit from this situation." "I was trying to do the right thing. That's all." Ashworth continued his attack, but Claire remained composed, her testimony solid. The jury was watching closely, and it was clear that they were not swayed by Ashworth's tactics. But Ashworth had one more card to play. He called Julian Croft to the stand. Croft was an impressive figure as he took the witness box, his posture perfect, his voice calm and measured. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling his image, and he knew exactly how to present himself to the jury. "I am not guilty of these crimes," Croft said, his voice steady. "I have been falsely accused by people who want to destroy me. The witnesses who have testified against me are liars, motivated by jealousy and revenge." "You're saying that all of the witnesses are lying?" Sir Geoffrey asked, his voice incredulous. I'm saying that they have their own agendas, Croft replied. They have their own reasons for wanting to see me convicted. I have done nothing wrong. Ashworth continued his questioning, building a portrait of Croft as a successful businessman who had been targeted by his enemies. He suggested that the attack on Emily had been committed by Silver alone, that Croft had no knowledge of what his nephew had done. I love my nephew, Croft said. I have always tried to protect him. But I had no idea what he was planning. I had no idea that he was going to attack that young woman. The courtroom was silent as Croft spoke. David watched the jury, trying to gauge their reactions. Some of them seemed to be swayed by Croft's testimony, his calm demeanor, his confident words. But David knew better. He knew that Croft was lying, that he had been the mastermind behind the attack, that he had orchestrated the entire operation from beginning to end. The cross-examination of Croft was brutal. Sir Geoffrey tore into him, presenting the evidence that had been gathered over months of investigation. He showed the emails, the financial records, the testimony of the witnesses who had placed Silver at the scene of the crime. Mr. Croft, isn't it true that you ordered the attack on Emily Mercer? Sir Geoffrey asked. Isn't it true that you used your nephew as an instrument of your will? That is a lie, Croft replied, his voice firm. I had nothing to do with the attack. Then why did you remove the CCTV camera from the alley where the attack occurred? Why did you make sure that there would be no evidence? I didn't remove the camera. I had no knowledge of its removal. The cross-examination continued for hours, with Sir Geoffrey methodically dismantling Croft's testimony. By the time it was over, Croft was visibly shaken, his confidence shattered, his lies exposed. David watched the proceedings with a grim satisfaction. The truth was finally coming out, and there was nothing that Croft could do to stop it. Chapter 18. The Summations. The trial was entering its final phase, with both sides preparing their closing arguments. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Sir Geoffrey Hamilton rose to his feet, his expression somber, his voice measured and deliberate. He had been practicing law for 30 years, and he knew how to deliver a summation that would resonate with a jury. Members of the jury, he began, you have heard the evidence. You have heard the testimony of the witnesses, seen the documents, examined the financial records. The evidence is overwhelming, and it points to one conclusion. Julian Croft and Marco Silva are guilty of the crimes they have been charged with. Let me remind you of the facts. Emily Mercer was a 17-year-old girl, walking home from a friend's house, when she was attacked in a dark alley. She was beaten, violated, and left for dead. She survived, but the scars, both visible and hidden, will never fully heal. The evidence has shown that the attack was planned, that it was orchestrated by Julian Croft, that he used his nephew as an instrument of his will. The evidence has shown that Croft used his power and influence to obstruct the course of justice, to intimidate witnesses, and to destroy evidence. The evidence has also shown that Croft engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud and corruption, stealing millions of pounds from the public purse and using his wealth to protect himself from accountability. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendants are guilty. I ask you, members of the jury, to return a verdict that reflects the gravity of their crimes. Sir Geoffrey sat down, his face flushed with the effort of his summation. The courtroom was silent, the jury watching him carefully. Lord Peter Ashworth rose to his feet, his expression grave. He had been preparing his summation for days, and he knew that this was his last chance to save his clients. Members of the jury, he began, the prosecution has presented a compelling case. But I ask you to consider the possibility that the evidence has been misinterpreted, that the witnesses have been motivated by personal vendettas, that the defendants are not as guilty as they appear. The prosecution has painted Julian Croft as a monster, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his interests. But I ask you to consider the possibility that Croft is a victim, a man who has been targeted by his enemies, a man who has been falsely accused of crimes he did not commit. Marco Silva has admitted his guilt. He has confessed to the attack on Emily Mercer. But he has also said that he acted alone, that his uncle had no knowledge of what he was planning. I ask you to consider the possibility that Silva is telling the truth, that Croft is innocent of the attack on Emily Mercer. I ask you to consider the possibility that the prosecution has presented a distorted picture of the evidence. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They must prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have any doubt, any at all, you must return a verdict of not guilty. Ashworth sat down, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He had done everything he could, had presented the best defense possible. Now it was up to the jury. The judge instructed the jury on the law, explaining the charges, the burden of proof, the standards that had to be met. The jury was then sent out to deliberate, their expressions serious, their faces unreadable. David watched the jury file out of the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done everything he could, had fought for justice with every weapon in his arsenal. Now it was out of his hands. He sat in the gallery, waiting for the verdict that would determine the fate of his daughter's attackers. He had been waiting for months, had endured the sleepless nights, the endless hours of investigation, the pain of seeing his daughter suffer. Now it was almost over. Chapter 19. The Verdict. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days when the verdict was finally announced. David had been in the gallery every hour, watching the doors of the courtroom, waiting for the moment that would change everything. When the jury returned, the courtroom was packed to capacity. David could see the tension on the faces of the lawyers, the journalists, the spectators. Everyone knew that the verdict would be historic, that it would send a message about the power of the law and the importance of justice. The judge entered the courtroom, his face expressionless. The jury took their seats, their faces unreadable. "Members of the jury," the judge said, "have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. "Please read the verdict." The foreman stood, his voice steady, his hands clasped in front of him. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. David felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and vindication. The foreman continued, reading the verdict on each of the charges. "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty." The foreman paused, looking at the judge. "On the charge of perverting the course of justice, we find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of the verdict sinking in. Julian Croft, one of the most powerful men in London, had been convicted of the most serious crimes a person could commit. He was facing years, possibly decades, in prison. The foreman turned to the second defendant. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Marco Silva, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant, Marco Silva, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Marco Silva, guilty." The courtroom was filled with the sound of cameras clicking, of journalists frantically taking notes, of spectators whispering to each other. The verdict was historic, a moment that would be remembered for years to come. David sat in the gallery, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the defendants. He had done it. He had fought for justice, had exposed the corruption that had protected his daughter's attacker, had brought the guilty to account. But the victory felt hollow. Emily was still scarred, still traumatized. The attack had changed her forever, had robbed her of her innocence, her joy, her sense of safety. Still, there was a measure of satisfaction in knowing that the men who had hurt her would face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't the perfect outcome, not by a long shot, but it was something. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. The courtroom emptied, the journalists rushing out to file their stories, the spectators filing out in a daze. David stood up, his legs shaky, his heart pounding. He made his way out of the gallery, down the stairs, out of the courthouse. The sun was shining, a rare sight in London. David stood on the steps of the Old Bailey, looking out at the crowd of journalists and spectators who had gathered to witness the verdict. He had done it. He had fought the system and won, had exposed the corruption that had protected his daughter's attacker. But the battle was not over. There was still more to do, more people to help, more injustices to expose. He walked away from the courthouse, his mind already turning to the next case. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 20. The Return. The weeks that followed the trial were a blur of media attention, legal proceedings, and the slow process of healing. David had become a public figure, the man who had brought down Julian Croft, the champion of forgotten justice. His phone rang constantly, with journalists from around the world wanting interviews, legal colleagues wanting advice, strangers wanting to share their own stories of injustice. He declined most of the interview requests, preferring to let the attention fade. He had not done this for fame or recognition. He had done it for Emily, for justice, for the principle that the law should protect everyone, not just those with power and influence. Emily had returned to the Slade School of Fine Art, her work slowly regaining the vibrancy that had characterized it before the attack. She was painting again, her canvases filled with color and light, images that seemed to embody the healing that was taking place within her. David visited her studio one afternoon, watching her work in silence. She was painting a landscape, a view of the Thames from a perspective he had never seen before. The colors were bright, hopeful, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed her for so long. "It's beautiful," he said finally. "You've captured something I've never seen before." Emily smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's how I see things now," she said. "The world is brighter than it used to be. It took me a long time to realize that." David felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride and love and relief. His daughter was healing, slowly but surely. The scars would never fully fade, but she was learning to live with them, to move forward with her life. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You're so strong." "I learned from the best," Emily replied. "You never gave up, Dad. You fought for me. You showed me that justice is possible." David took her hand, his eyes filled with tears. "I would do anything for you, Emily. Anything." "I know, Dad. I know." They stood together in the studio, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the paints drying on the canvases. It was a moment of peace, of healing, of hope. But David knew that the battle was not over. There were others who had been wronged by the system, others who needed his help. He had proven that the law could work, if only someone was willing to fight for it. He had become a voice for the forgotten, a champion of justice, a man who had turned his personal tragedy into a mission to help others. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. He established a small non-profit organization, The Last Appeal, dedicated to helping people who had been failed by the legal system. He used his experience and expertise to fight for justice, to expose corruption, to make the law work for everyone. The organization quickly gained a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning. David had become a master of the forgotten statute, the obscure precedent, the legal loophole that could be exploited to help the helpless. He worked long hours, often into the night, his study filled with the papers and files that represented his life's work. But he also made time for Emily, for their walks along the Thames, for the quiet moments that had come to mean so much to him. The scars of the attack would never fully heal, but Emily was learning to live with them. She was painting again, laughing again, living again. She had found a strength that she hadn't known she possessed, and she was determined to use it to make the world a better place. David watched her with pride, knowing that he had done everything he could to protect her, to support her, to give her the tools she needed to rebuild her life. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 21. The New Client. The morning mail brought a letter that would change everything. David sat in his study, the morning sun streaming through the windows, a cup of tea cooling beside him. He had been reviewing the files of several potential cases, trying to decide which ones to take on. The Last Appeal had grown quickly, its reputation spreading through word of mouth and the occasional news article. People who had been failed by the system, who had nowhere else to turn, were reaching out to him. But the letter that arrived that morning was different. It was handwritten, the script elegant and precise, the kind of handwriting that spoke of education and breeding. The paper was expensive, heavy, with a subtle watermark that David recognized as the mark of a high-end stationer. He opened the envelope carefully, sliding out the single sheet of paper within. The letter was brief, barely a paragraph, but its contents made his heart race. Dear Mr. Mercer, I have followed your work with great interest. The case of your daughter was a triumph of justice, a testament to the power of the law when wielded by someone with the courage to fight for what is right. I write to you now because I find myself in a similar situation. I have been wronged by the system, my voice silenced, my reputation destroyed. I have nowhere else to turn. I have enclosed my contact information. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Ashworth. David read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. Eleanor Ashworth. The name was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He racked his brain, trying to remember where he had heard it before. And then it came to him. Eleanor Ashworth was the wife of Lord Peter Ashworth, the barrister who had defended Julian Croft. The same Lord Peter Ashworth who had tried to tear apart the prosecution's case, who had done everything in his power to secure Croft's acquittal. David felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The man who had defended his daughter's attacker was now reaching out for help. It was ironic, almost poetic, a twist of fate that he could not have anticipated. But David was a professional. He knew that everyone deserved a fair hearing, regardless of who they were or what they had done. If Eleanor Ashworth had a legitimate grievance, he would listen. He would investigate. He would do everything in his power to help. He picked up the phone and dialed the number that was enclosed in the letter. Hello. The voice on the other end was female, cultured, with an undertone of weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. Mrs. Ashworth? This is David Mercer. I received your letter. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. Mr. Mercer. Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. I'm a solicitor, Mrs. Ashworth. It's my job to listen to people who need help. What can I do for you? I need to meet with you. In person. There are things I can't discuss over the phone. I understand. Where would you like to meet? They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the British Museum, a quiet spot that was popular with academics and researchers. David arrived early, finding a table in the corner where they could speak without being overheard. Eleanor Ashworth arrived precisely on time. She was a tall woman, elegant and refined, with silver-streaked hair that was swept back from a face that was striking rather than beautiful. Her eyes were a deep blue, troubled, haunted by something that David could not identify. Thank you for coming, Mr. Mercer, she said, taking a seat across from him. I know this must be difficult for you, given the circumstances. I'm a professional, Mrs. Ashworth. I don't let personal feelings interfere with my work. Tell me what's happened. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. It's about my husband. Peter. He's been accused of something terrible. Something that could destroy his career, his reputation, his entire life. David leaned forward, his interest piqued. What has he been accused of? Bribery.
Corruption.
He's been accused of accepting money from Julian Croft to secure a more lenient sentence for his clients. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was serious. Bribery and corruption were among the most serious charges that could be leveled against a barrister. If the allegations were true, Peter Ashworth could be disbarred, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. Do you have any evidence? David asked. Any proof that the allegations are false? That's the problem, Eleanor replied, her voice trembling. I have proof that the allegations are true. David stared at her, unable to process what he had just heard. I'm sorry, he said. You're telling me that your husband is guilty. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. He's been working for Croft for years. He's been taking money from him, using his position to protect him from the consequences of his actions. I found the evidence in his study, bank statements, emails, everything. And you want me to help him? David's voice was incredulous. You want me to defend a man who has been taking bribes, who has been perverting the course of justice, who has been protecting criminals? I want you to help me, Mr. Mercer. I want to expose the truth. I want to do the right thing. David was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. This was a situation unlike any he had faced before. A woman was asking him to help expose her own husband, to bring down a man who had been one of the most respected barristers in the country. Why now? He asked finally. Why not do this sooner? Because I didn't know, Eleanor replied. I didn't know what he was doing until I found the evidence in his study. I confronted him, and he admitted everything. He told me that he had been taking money from Croft for years, that he had used his position to protect him from the consequences of his actions. I was horrified. I told him that I couldn't live with the lie anymore, that I was going to expose the truth. He begged me not to, said that it would destroy our family. But I couldn't keep living the lie. I had to do the right thing. David sat back in his chair, studying Eleanor's face. She was telling the truth, of that he was certain. The tears, the trembling, the desperate plea for help, these were not the signs of a woman who was lying. But the implications of what she was asking were staggering. Exposing a barrister for taking bribes would be a scandal of epic proportions. It would shake the legal system to its foundations, force a reckoning that had been long overdue. Mrs. Ashworth, he said carefully. I understand that you want to do the right thing. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Of course. Are you prepared for the consequences? If we expose your husband's crimes, he will be disbarred. He will go to prison. Your family will be destroyed. Are you ready for that? Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to do the right thing, Mr. Mercer. I can't live with the lie anymore. I can't pretend that everything is okay when it's not. I have to do this, for myself, for my children, for everyone who has been hurt by what Peter has done. David nodded slowly. He understood her decision, even if he didn't fully agree with it. The truth was important, more important than reputation, more important than family, more important than anything. Okay, he said finally. I'll help you. But I need to see the evidence first. I need to know exactly what we are dealing with. Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick envelope. Everything is in there, she said. Bank statements, emails, copies of the payments. It's all there. David took the envelope, his hands steady despite the gravity of what he was holding. I'll review everything and get back to you, he said. And Mrs. Ashworth, I want you to know that I understand how difficult this must be for you. You're doing the right thing. I hope so, Mr. Mercer. I really hope so. Chapter 22. The Evidence. David spent the next week reviewing the evidence that Eleanor Ashworth had provided. The documents were damning, comprehensive, and utterly devastating to Peter Ashworth's reputation. The bank statements showed regular payments from a shell company that was owned by Julian Croft. The payments were substantial, totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds over several years. They were made to accounts that were held in Peter Ashworth's name, accounts that had been hidden from the tax authorities and from anyone who might have been investigating his financial affairs. The emails were even more revealing. They showed a pattern of communication between Ashworth and Croft, a web of conspiracy that had been going on for years. Ashworth had been providing legal advice to Croft, helping him to structure his business affairs in ways that were designed to avoid scrutiny. But the most damning evidence was a single email, written shortly after Croft's arrest. In the email, Ashworth offered to help Croft secure a more lenient sentence in exchange for a substantial payment. The email was explicit, leaving no room for doubt about what was being proposed. Dear Julian, the email read, I have been reviewing the evidence against you, and I believe that I can secure a more favorable outcome if certain arrangements can be made. I would be happy to discuss this with you further at your earliest convenience. David read the email 3 times, his mind racing. This was the smoking gun, the evidence that proved beyond any doubt that Peter Ashworth had been engaged in a corrupt relationship with Julian Croft. He sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. This was a major scandal, one that would rock the legal system to its foundations. A barrister of Ashworth's standing, someone who had been appointed to the rank of Queen's Counsel, who had defended some of the most prominent figures in the country, was guilty of the most serious crime that a lawyer could commit. But David also knew that the evidence was not enough on its own. He needed to verify the documents, to confirm their authenticity, to make sure that they had not been fabricated or tampered with. He reached out to a forensic accountant he had worked with on previous cases, a woman named Margaret Chen who had a reputation for meticulousness and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Margaret was a small, wiry woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a sharp tongue, and she had helped David on several occasions. I need you to verify these documents, David said, handing her the envelope. I need to know that they're genuine. Margaret took the envelope, her eyes scanning the contents. This is big, she said finally. This is really big. I know. That's why I need you to be thorough. Margaret nodded, her expression serious. I'll get back to you in a few days. 3 days later, she called David with her findings. The documents are genuine, she said. The bank statements match the records of the institutions that issued them. The emails are authentic. There's no doubt about it. David felt a surge of relief, followed by a wave of apprehension. The evidence was genuine, which meant that he had a case. But the case was so big, so explosive, that he was not sure how to proceed. I'll need to go to the police, he said finally. This is a criminal matter. Are you sure about that? Margaret asked. The police have been unreliable in the past. They might not take this seriously. "They will this time," David replied. "I'll make sure of it." He contacted Detective Inspector Miller, the man who had been assigned to Emily's case. Miller had been part of the problem, had failed to pursue the investigation with the diligence that it deserved. But he was also a man who had been humiliated by the trial, who had been publicly exposed for his failures. "Detective Inspector," David said when Miller answered the phone, "I have some information that I think you'll find interesting." "I'm listening, Mr. Mercer." "I have evidence of corruption involving Peter Ashworth, the barrister who defended Julian Croft. I have bank statements, emails, and other documents that prove Ashworth has been taking bribes from Croft for years." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David could practically hear Miller's mind racing, processing the implications of what he had just been told. "You're sure about this?" Miller asked finally. "You're absolutely sure?" "I'm absolutely sure. The documents have been verified by a forensic accountant. There's no doubt about it." "Where are the documents?" "I have copies. I'll bring them to you." "Don't bring them to me," Miller said quickly. "I'll come to you. This is too important to risk. Give me your address, and I'll be there in an hour." David gave him the address and hung up. He sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment that could change everything. If Miller took the evidence seriously, if the police launched an investigation, Peter Ashworth would be brought to justice. But even as he thought this, David knew that the battle was not over. Ashworth was a powerful man, with connections and influence that could be used to protect himself. The case would be difficult, the opposition fierce, the outcome uncertain. Still, he had to try. He had to do everything in his power to expose the truth, to bring the guilty to justice, to make the law work for everyone. Miller arrived in exactly 1 hour, looking haggard and nervous. He was not the same man who had dismissed David's concerns months ago. He was a man who had been humiliated, who had been forced to confront his own failures, who was now eager to make amends. "Show me the evidence," Miller said, his voice urgent. David handed him the envelope. Miller opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. As he read, his face grew pale, his hands trembling slightly. This is unbelievable," he said finally. "Ashworth has been working for Croft for years. He's been protecting him, helping him avoid the consequences of his actions." "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell you," David said. Croft had a network of influence that extended into every corner of the legal system. Ashworth was just one part of it. "What do you want me to do with this?" "I want you to launch an investigation. I want you to bring Ashworth to justice." Miller nodded, his expression grim. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves." But even as he said the words, David could see the doubt in his eyes. Miller was a man who had been burned before, who had failed to pursue the investigation of Emily's attack with the diligence it deserved. He was not a man who inspired confidence. "I'll need to inform the Crown Prosecution Service," Miller said. "They'll need to decide whether to bring charges." "Do it," David said. "Do it now, before anyone can destroy the evidence." Miller nodded and left, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. David watched him go, a sense of unease settling over him. He had done everything he could, had presented the evidence, had made the case for justice. But he knew that the battle was far from over. Chapter 23. The investigation begins. The Crown Prosecution Service launched an investigation into Peter Ashworth's activities, led by a senior prosecutor named Robert Thornton. Thornton was a man with a reputation for integrity, a prosecutor who had never been tainted by scandal or corruption. He was the perfect choice for the job. The investigation proceeded quickly, with Thornton's team working around the clock to verify the evidence that David had provided. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed financial records, traced the flow of money through the shell companies that had been used to pay Ashworth. The findings were damning. Ashworth had been taking bribes from Croft for years, using his position to protect him from the consequences of his actions. He had perverted the course of justice, subverted the legal system, and betrayed the trust of everyone who had ever believed in him. Thornton presented the evidence to a senior judge, requesting a warrant for Ashworth's arrest. The request was granted, and Ashworth was arrested at his home in the early hours of the morning, his career and reputation in ruins. The arrest was front-page news, the story dominating the headlines for days. Ashworth, who had once been one of the most respected barristers in the country, was now a disgraced criminal, facing charges of bribery, corruption, and perverting the course of justice. Eleanor Ashworth watched the coverage from her home, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She had done the right thing, had exposed the truth, had brought her husband to justice. But the cost had been enormous, a price that she was only beginning to understand. David visited her a few days after the arrest, finding her in a state of shock. She was sitting in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life that had been shattered. "I did the right thing," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I did. But why does it feel so wrong?" "It's always difficult to do the right thing," David replied, his voice gentle. "Especially when it costs you so much." "I lost everything," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "My husband, my family, my reputation. Everything." "Your reputation is intact," David said firmly. "You did the right thing. You exposed the truth. That's something to be proud of." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile flickering across her face. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. For everything." "You're welcome, Mrs. Ashworth. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." David left the house, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The law had worked, had brought a corrupt man to justice, had exposed the truth. But the cost had been enormous, a price that had been paid by an innocent woman who had only been trying to do the right thing. He walked through the streets of London, the city that he had called home for his entire life, the city that was both beautiful and brutal. He thought about Emily, about the attack that had changed everything, about the fight for justice that had consumed him. He had won. He had brought the guilty to justice, had exposed the corruption that had protected them, had made the law work for everyone. But the victory felt hollow, a bitter taste in his mouth. The legal system was broken, corrupted by power and influence and the willingness to look the other way. He had fought to make it work, had used every weapon in his arsenal, had exposed the truth. But the system was still broken. There were others like Ashworth, others who had been corrupted by the promise of power and wealth. The battle was far from over. David resolved to continue his work. He would help others who had been wronged by the system, would expose the corruption that was so deeply embedded in the legal system, would fight for justice until his dying breath. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 24. The Aftermath. The trial of Peter Ashworth was a spectacle unlike any that London had seen in years. The courtroom was packed every day, the journalists and spectators eager to see the downfall of a man who had once been one of the most respected barristers in the country. The prosecution case was overwhelming, the evidence that David had uncovered proving beyond any doubt that Ashworth was guilty of the crimes he had been charged with. The defense did its best, trying to cast doubt on the evidence, but the case was too strong, the evidence too compelling. Ashworth was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was also disbarred, his reputation destroyed, his career in ruins. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and anger, the public outrage that a man of such high standing had been engaged in such corrupt activities. The legal system was shaken, forced to confront the reality of its own corruption, the extent to which it had been subverted by power and influence. David watched the trial from the gallery, his expression grim. He had done everything he could, had exposed the truth, had brought a corrupt man to justice. But the victory was bittersweet, a reminder of the cost that justice sometimes demanded. Eleanor Ashworth was in the gallery as well, her face a mask of pain and loss. She had lost her husband, her family, her reputation. She had done the right thing, but the cost had been enormous. She approached David after the trial, her eyes red from weeping. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For everything." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashworth," David replied, his voice gentle. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "It's what I needed," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I needed to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it was." David nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. "If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." Eleanor nodded and walked away, her shoulders hunched, her spirit broken. David watched her go, feeling a sense of sadness that he could not explain. The legal system was broken, corrupted by power and influence and the willingness to look the other way. He had fought to make it work, had used every weapon in his arsenal, had exposed the truth. But the system was still broken. There were others like Ashworth, others who had been corrupted by the promise of power and wealth. The battle was far from over. David resolved to continue his work. He would help others who had been wronged by the system, would expose the corruption that was so deeply embedded in the legal system, would fight for justice until his dying breath. He returned to his study, the familiar surroundings a comfort after the chaos of the trial. The walls were lined with books, the shelves filled with the legal texts that had been his companions for so many years. He had won. He had brought the guilty to justice, had exposed the corruption that had protected them, had made the law work for everyone. But the victory felt hollow, a bitter taste in his mouth. The legal system was broken, and it would take more than one trial to fix it. He picked up his phone and called Sarah Harding, the journalist who had helped him so much during the investigation of Emily's attack. "Sarah, I need your help again." "Of course, David. What do you need?" "I need to expose the corruption in the legal system. I need to show the world that the system is broken, that there are others like Ashworth who are profiting from the suffering of others." "I'll do whatever I can," Sarah said. "Just tell me what you need." "I need you to write another story. I need you to show the world the truth. Send me the evidence. I'll get to work." David hung up, a sense of determination washing over him. The battle was far from over. He would continue to fight for justice, to expose the truth, to make the law work for everyone. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 25. The New Mission. The story that Sarah Harding wrote was explosive, a detailed expose of the corruption that was so deeply embedded in the legal system. She laid out the evidence, the names, the patterns of behavior that had been allowed to continue for years. The reaction was immediate and intense. The public was outraged, demanding that the government take action to clean up the legal system. The legal profession was in turmoil, forced to confront the reality of its own corruption, the extent to which it had been subverted by power and influence. The government launched a formal inquiry into the legal system, led by a senior judge who had a reputation for integrity. The inquiry was broad in scope, looking at the way the system operated, the relationships between lawyers and their clients, the influence of money on the course of justice. David was called to testify before the inquiry, his evidence invaluable in helping the commission understand the extent of the corruption that had been allowed to flourish. He spoke for hours, his words measured, his arguments compelling, his commitment to justice unwavering. The inquiry issued its report a year later, a comprehensive document that laid out the problems in the legal system and made recommendations for reform. The report was widely praised, its conclusions accepted by the government and the legal profession. David read the report with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had played a part in making the legal system better, more accountable, more just. But even as he celebrated the victory, he knew that the battle was far from over. The legal system was still flawed, still vulnerable to corruption, still in need of reform. He continued his work with the last appeal, taking on cases that no one else would touch. He used his knowledge of forgotten statutes, his skill at navigating the legal system, his determination to fight for justice. He helped a single mother who had been unfairly evicted from her home. He helped a whistleblower who had been fired for exposing corruption in his company. He helped a community that had been devastated by a toxic waste dump, using the law to force the responsible parties to clean up their mess. Each case was different, but the pattern was the same. The law had failed to protect the innocent, and David was there to remind the system that it had a duty to do so. He was a champion of justice, a voice for the voiceless, a man who had turned his personal tragedy into a mission to help others. Emily had returned to art school, her work gaining recognition and praise. She had exhibited at several galleries, her paintings selling for prices that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. She was building a life for herself, a life that was full of hope and possibility. David watched her with pride, knowing that she had overcome the worst that life could throw at her. She was strong, resilient, and determined to make the most of her future. One evening, Emily came to his study, a painting in her hands. "I made this for you," she said, holding it out to him. "I wanted to thank you for everything." David took the painting, his eyes filling with tears. It was a portrait of the two of them, standing together on a beach, the sun setting behind them. The colors were warm, hopeful, filled with the promise of a future that was bright and full of possibility. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Emily." "I wanted to show you that I'm okay," Emily said. "I wanted to show you that I'm moving forward." that I'm not letting what happened define me. David set the painting down and pulled his daughter into a hug. I'm so proud of you, he said. I'm so proud of the person you've become. Dad, Emily said, pulling back to look at him. I want to help you. I want to work with you at the last appeal. I want to use my art to help people. David stared at her, surprised by the offer. Are you sure? He asked. You have your own career, your own life. I know, Emily said. But I want to do something meaningful. I want to use my skills to help others. Just like you did. David nodded slowly, a sense of pride and love washing over him. His daughter was not just surviving, she was thriving. She was finding her own way, her own purpose, her own voice. Okay, he said. We'll find a way to make it work. Emily smiled, a smile that lit up her face and filled David's heart with joy. Thank you, Dad, she said. Thank you for everything. No, David said, pulling her close again. Thank you, Emily, for showing me what true courage really looks like. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer, with his daughter at his side, would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 26, The Algorithm of Justice. The notification arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. David Mercer had been sleeping fitfully, his mind still churning with the details of the Ashworth case, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it instinctively, his eyes adjusting to the harsh glare of the screen. It was an automated alert from the National Archives, one of the many legal monitoring systems he had configured months ago. The alert flagged a new statutory instrument laid before Parliament that morning, the Energy, Euratom Decisions and Miscellaneous Provisions, Amendment and Revocation, Regulations 2025. He read the notification twice, his legal mind already categorizing its significance. Another batch of obsolete laws being formally revoked. 37 instruments of secondary assimilated law, swept from the statute book like dust from an ancient shelf. David sat up in bed, his heart racing with an excitement that surprised him. He had spent the last 2 years of his life uncovering forgotten statutes, weaponizing laws that everyone else had dismissed as dead letters. And now, the government was finally doing what he had been doing alone, cleaning house, revoking the obsolete, regularizing the statute book. But as he scrolled through the notification, a thought struck him. The government had found 1,400 long-forgotten retained EU laws during this exercise, legislation that had been sitting on the books for years, quietly gathering dust, never enforced, never applied. Laws that, like the 1847 Act he had used to crack the Emily case wide open, had been hiding in plain sight. If the government could find 1,400 forgotten laws in one sweep, how many more were still out there? How many other statutes, buried in the archives, waiting for someone to dust them off and remember that they still had power? David reached for his laptop, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had been working on a new case, a complex property dispute that involved a local council's refusal to release records under the Freedom of Information Act. The case was stalled, mired in bureaucratic delays and legal technicalities. But what if there was another way? What if there was an older statute, something predating the FOIA, that could be used to force the council's hand? He began to search, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The 1847 Act had been a goldmine, but it was just one of hundreds of ancient laws that had never been repealed. Some dated back to the 14th century. The Statute of Westminster of 1275, for instance, still had chapters in force today, including one guaranteeing free elections. The Statute of Merton of 1235, considered the first English statute, had only been fully repealed in Ireland in 1983. And then there were the truly bizarre laws, the ones that were so obviously obsolete that no one even bothered to enforce them anymore. In York, it was still technically legal to shoot a Scotsman with a crossbow, as long as it wasn't a Sunday. In Britain, it was still an offence under the Metropolitan Police Act 1839 to beat a carpet in the street. The Licensing Act 1872 still made it illegal to get drunk in an English pub. The Salmon Act 1986 still made it an offence to handle salmon in suspicious circumstances. Most of these laws were quaint curiosities, preserved for their heritage value or simply forgotten in the mists of parliamentary time. But some of them were more than curiosities. Some of them were weapons, waiting to be rediscovered by someone who knew how to use them. David's search led him down a rabbit hole of legal history. He found the repeal of Obsolete Statutes Act 1856, the first Statute Law Revision Act, which had repealed 120 obsolete acts dating back to 1285. He found the work of the Law Commission, which had been systematically pruning the statute book for decades, repealing over 3,000 whole acts and achieving partial repeals in thousands more. But the Law Commission's work was painstakingly slow. It had to consult with government departments, the Welsh Assembly, the Scottish Government, the Northern Ireland Executive. Every repeal had to be carefully considered, every potential consequence weighed. The process was thorough, but it was glacial. And in the meantime, the forgotten laws remained on the books. Some of them were genuinely harmful. The Vagrancy Act, for instance, an antiquated piece of legislation that made it a crime to sleep rough or beg in England and Wales. Parliament had voted to repeal it in 2022, but the repeal had never been brought into force. More than 1,000 days later, the act was still being used to criminalize homeless people. David stared at the screen, his mind racing. The law was a living thing, a vast and complex organism that was constantly evolving. But evolution left behind fossils, remnants of earlier forms that served no purpose but remained embedded in the system. Most people ignored these fossils, treating them as curiosities or relics. But to David, they were something else entirely. They were opportunities. He thought about the property dispute he had been working on. The council had been stonewalling him for months, refusing to release the records he needed. But what if he could use an old statute to force their hand? What if there was a provision in some dusty volume of law that gave citizens the right to inspect local government records, a right that predated the FOIA and its countless exemptions? He began to search, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He searched for public records, local government, right of inspection. He searched through the statutes of the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th. And then he found it. The Parish Vestries Act of 1831 was an obscure piece of legislation that had been passed to regulate the administration of parish affairs. It contained a provision stating that any ratepayer had the right to inspect the records of the parish vestry, including those related to public health, sanitation, and local governance. The act had been largely superseded by subsequent legislation, but it had never been formally repealed. Like the 1847 Act, it was a fossil, a remnant of an earlier legal era that still had the power to shape the present. David read the provision 3 times, a slow smile spreading across his face. This was exactly what he needed. The council was a modern local authority, the successor to the parish vestries that had once administered local affairs. Under the provisions of the 1831 Act, they were legally obligated to provide him with the records he was seeking. He began to draft a letter, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He cited the Act, quoted the relevant provision, and demanded that the council comply with his request within 7 days. He included a copy of the Act and highlighted the relevant sections. The letter was a masterpiece of legal persuasion, a document that would force the council's legal team to confront a statute they had probably never even heard of. David sent it off with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had once again found a forgotten tool that could be used to fight for justice. The response came 3 days later. The council's legal team had clearly been thrown into chaos by the letter. They had tried to find some way to deny the request, but the law was clear. The 1831 Act was still in force, and David's rights under it were unambiguous. "We will provide you with access to the records you have requested," the letter read. "Please contact our archives department to arrange a suitable time for your inspection." David grinned. Another victory. Another forgotten statute, dusted off and put to work. But as he sat back in his chair, the smile slowly faded from his face. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The legal system was a labyrinth of forgotten statutes, obsolete provisions, and ancient laws that had never been repealed. Each one was a potential weapon, a tool that could be used to fight for justice. But they were also traps. Laws that had been forgotten for a reason, provisions that had been superseded by more modern legislation, ancient statutes that were incompatible with modern human rights law. Using them was a gamble, a calculated risk that could backfire spectacularly. David knew that he was walking a fine line. He was a legal vigilante, a man who used the law to fight for justice in ways that the system had never intended. He was dangerous, not because he broke the law, but because he used it in ways that no one else had thought to try. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 27. The Sanctuary of the Forgotten. The case that arrived in David's inbox the following morning was unlike anything he had ever seen. It came from a small community group in East London, a coalition of residents who had been fighting for years to save a historic building from demolition. The building was a Victorian-era church that had been decommissioned decades ago and had fallen into disrepair. But it was a landmark, a piece of the community's heritage that the residents were determined to preserve. The developers had been relentless. They had filed permits, secured approvals, greased the wheels of local government. The residents had fought back with every tool at their disposal: petitions, protests, planning appeals. But they were losing, and they knew it. "We've tried everything," the group's leader, a woman named Margaret Chen, told David over the phone. "We've been to the council, we've been to the courts, we've been to the media. Nothing works. The developers have all the money, all the influence, all the connections." David listened, his mind already working. "Tell me more about the building," he said. "What is it, exactly?" "It's a church. St. Mary's, built in 1875. It's been empty for 20 years, but it's still beautiful. The stained glass windows, the vaulted ceiling, the stonework, it's a masterpiece. And the developers want to tear it down and build luxury flats." David made a note on his legal pad. "Is it listed?" "No. We tried to get it listed, but the council blocked it. They said it wasn't historically significant enough." David leaned forward, his interest piqued. The council had blocked the listing. That was interesting. Under the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas, Act 1990, the council had a duty to consider applications for listing. If they had blocked the application, they had to have a reason. "What was the reason?" he asked. "They said the building had been too heavily modified. That the original features had been stripped out over the years." David nodded slowly. This was the kind of bureaucratic sleight of hand that he had seen many times before. The council had found a technicality to deny the application, a way to avoid the responsibility of protecting the building. He reached for his laptop and began to search. There had to be something, some forgotten statute or obscure provision that could be used to force the council's hand. And then he found it. The Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction and Care of Churches Measure 2011 was a relatively modern piece of legislation, but it had its roots in ancient law. It governed the treatment of decommissioned churches, establishing a framework for their protection and preservation. The key provision was Section 63, which stated that any decommissioned church that had been in existence for more than 50 years could not be demolished without the permission of the church commissioners. The permission had to be granted in writing, and it had to take into account the building's historical and architectural significance. David read the section 3 times, his mind racing. The church had been built in 1875, which meant it had been in existence for well over 50 years. The church commissioners were the governing body of the Church of England, and they had the power to block the demolition of any church that fell under their jurisdiction. But there was a catch. The developers had already obtained planning permission from the council. The church commissioners had not been consulted, because the council had treated the building as a secular structure rather than a religious one. This was a legal loophole, a gap in the system that the developers had exploited. But it was also an opportunity. David picked up the phone and called the church commissioner's office. The conversation that followed was one of the most bizarre he had ever had. "I'm calling about St. Mary's Church in East London," he said. "The developers are planning to demolish it, and I believe that you have the authority to block the demolition." The voice on the other end of the line was confused. "St. Mary's? I'm not familiar with that church. It's not on our list of active parishes." "It's decommissioned," David explained. "It's been empty for 20 years. But it's still a church, and it's been in existence for more than 50 years. Under Section 63 of the Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction and Care of Churches Measure 2011, you have the authority to block its demolition." There was a long pause. "I'm not sure that's correct," the voice said finally. "The measure applies to active churches, not decommissioned ones." "I've read the measure," David replied, his voice calm but firm. "There's no exemption for decommissioned churches. The section applies to all churches that have been in existence for more than 50 years, regardless of their current status." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll need to check with our legal team," the voice said. "Can I call you back?" "Of course." David hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. He had found another forgotten provision, another law that everyone had overlooked. The developers thought they had won, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed that the church was just another building, subject only to the planning laws. They had forgotten that it was a church. And churches were governed by a different set of rules, a set of rules that had been established centuries ago, when the Church of England had been the most powerful institution in the land. The church commissioners called back the next day. They had checked with their legal team, and they had confirmed that David was correct. Under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction and care of Churches Measure 2011, they did have the authority to block the demolition of any church that had been in existence for more than 50 years, regardless of its current status. "We will be issuing a formal notice to the developers," the voice said. "They cannot demolish the church without our permission. We will also be reviewing the listing application that was rejected by the council. It appears that the council may have acted inappropriately." David smiled. "Thank you," he said. "You've just saved a piece of history." "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Without your intervention, we might never have known about this situation." David hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. Another victory. Another forgotten law, dusted off and put to work. But as he sat there, a thought struck him. The law was full of these forgotten provisions, these ancient statutes that had never been repealed. Most of them were harmless curiosities, relics of a bygone era. But some of them were weapons, tools that could be used to fight for justice. He had used the 1847 Act to force the council to release records. He had used the 1831 Act to access local government documents. He had used the ecclesiastical jurisdiction and care of churches measure to save a historic building. What other forgotten laws were out there? What other weapons were waiting to be discovered? David reached for his laptop and began to search. The law was a vast and complex organism, a labyrinth of statutes and provisions that stretched back centuries. There were thousands of forgotten laws, millions of words of legal text that no one had read in decades. But David was determined to find them. He would search every archive, read every statute, uncover every forgotten provision. He would build an arsenal of legal weapons that could be used to fight for justice. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 28. The Digital Archivist. The sheer scale of the task was staggering. David had been at it for weeks, working through the archives, cataloguing the forgotten statutes. He had started with the 19th century, working his way backward and forward through time. He had found hundreds of laws that had never been repealed, provisions that had been forgotten by everyone except the legal scholars who studied them. The work was tedious, painstaking, and utterly consuming. But it was also exhilarating. Every discovery was a potential weapon, a tool that could be used to fight for justice. He was in the middle of reviewing the Shipping Offences Act 1793 when Emily knocked on his study door. "Dad, you need to take a break," she said, her voice firm. "You've been at this for hours. You haven't eaten, you haven't slept, you haven't even left the room." David looked up, blinking. "I'm fine, Emily. I'm just in the middle of something." "You're always in the middle of something." She crossed the room and looked over his shoulder at the screen. "What is all this?" "Forgotten laws," David said, gesturing at the screen. "There are thousands of them, Emily. Thousands of statutes and provisions that have never been repealed. Most of them are obsolete, but some of them are still enforceable. And I am going to find every single one of them." Emily looked at the screen, her eyes scanning the text. "That's a lot of work, Dad. You can't do it alone." "I've been doing it alone for 2 years," David replied, a note of frustration creeping into his voice. "Why should now be any different?" "Because you don't have to be alone anymore." Emily pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. "I'm here now. Let me help you." David stared at his daughter, surprised by the offer. "Emily, you're an artist. You're not a lawyer." "I'm good with computers," she said. "And I'm good with organization. I can help you build a database, a catalog of all these forgotten laws. That way, when you need to find something, you can just search for it." David was silent for a moment, considering the offer. He had been working alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have help. But Emily was right. The task was too big for one person. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." The work that followed was unlike anything David had ever experienced. Emily brought a level of organization and efficiency that he had never known. She created a database, cataloging each law by date, subject, jurisdiction, and enforceability. She cross-referenced the provisions, creating links between related statutes and identifying gaps in the legal framework. She was a natural, a digital archivist who could navigate the complexities of the legal system with ease. David watched her work, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. His daughter was not just surviving, she was thriving. She had found a purpose, a way to use her skills to make a difference. "How did you become so good at this?" he asked one evening, as they were reviewing the database. "I've always been good with computers," Emily said with a shrug. "I never really used it before, but it's not that hard. It's just a matter of organizing the information." "I'm not talking about the computers," David said. "I'm talking about the law. You're not a lawyer, but you understand the legal system better than most people I know." Emily smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I learned from you, Dad. I've been watching you for 2 years. I've seen how you think, how you approach problems, how you find solutions. I just applied what I learned." David felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long consumed by his mission that he had forgotten the impact it was having on his daughter. She had been watching him, learning from him, becoming his partner in ways he had never anticipated. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet, Dad. We are just getting started." The database grew rapidly, Emily's organizational skills making quick work of the massive task. Within a month, they had catalogued over 2,000 forgotten laws, each one carefully categorized and cross-referenced. They had created a powerful tool, a weapon that could be used to fight for justice in ways that no one had ever imagined. The first test came 3 weeks later, when a community in the north of England contacted David for help. A local council was planning to sell a public park to a private developer, a move that would destroy one of the few green spaces in the area. "We've tried everything," the community leader said. "We've petitioned, we've protested, we've gone to the media. Nothing works. The council says they have the legal authority to sell the land." David searched the database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He found what he was looking for in less than 5 minutes. "The Open Spaces Act 1906, he said. "It's still in force, and it gives local communities the right to prevent the sale of public land that has been used for recreation for more than 20 years. The community leader was skeptical. "Are you sure about that? The council says the law doesn't apply." "The council is wrong," David replied. "The act is still in force, and it gives you the right to challenge the sale. I'll send you the details." The community challenged the sale, citing the Open Spaces Act. The council was forced to back down, the sale cancelled, the park preserved. Another victory. Another forgotten law, dusted off and put to work. David and Emily celebrated that evening, a rare moment of joy in a life that had been consumed by struggle. They sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, talking about everything and nothing. "You know, Dad," Emily said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I think we might be on to something here." "What do you mean?" "The database. The forgotten laws. We are building something that could really help people. We could make a difference." "We already are making a difference," David said. "We've helped dozens of people, saved buildings, protected communities. And we are just getting started." "I know," Emily said. "But I'm thinking bigger. What if we opened the database to the public? Made it available to anyone who needs it?" David was silent for a moment, considering the idea. The database was a powerful tool, a weapon that could be used to fight for justice. But it was also dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could be used to exploit loopholes, to evade the law, to harm the very people it was designed to protect. "I don't know," he said finally. "The database is powerful, but it's also dangerous. We need to be careful about who has access to it." "I agree," Emily said. "But we can't keep it to ourselves forever. There are people out there who need help, who are fighting against injustice just like we were. They need the same tools that we have." David nodded slowly. She was right. The database was too powerful to keep hidden. It had to be shared, used for the benefit of all. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." The database went live the following month, a free resource available to anyone who needed it. It was a small step, a modest contribution to the cause of justice. But it was also a beginning, the start of something that could change the world. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer, with his daughter at his side, would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 29. The Act of 1845. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m., time-stamped precisely, as if the sender had been waiting for the exact moment to strike. It was from a law firm in the city, one of the most prestigious in London. The subject line was simple: Re. Mercer versus Covent Garden Estates. David opened the email, his heart sinking as he read the contents. The firm was representing the developers who had been trying to demolish the Victorian church. They had filed an appeal, challenging the church commissioner's decision to block the demolition. The appeal was based on a technicality. David read the email 3 times, his mind racing. This was a serious challenge, one that could undermine everything he had accomplished. If the developers won their appeal, the church would be demolished, and the precedent would be set for future challenges. He needed to fight back, and he needed to do it quickly. He turned to his database, searching for any provision that could be used to block the appeal. He searched for statutes related to churches, historic buildings, and planning law. He searched for provisions that had been forgotten, ignored, or overlooked. And then he found it. The Church Building Commissioners Act 1845 was a piece of legislation that had been passed to facilitate the construction of new churches in the growing cities of Victorian Britain. It had established the Church Building Commissioners, a body that was responsible for approving the construction of new churches and overseeing the management of church properties. The Act had been largely superseded by subsequent legislation, but it had never been formally repealed. It was still in force, still technically enforceable. But what made it relevant was a single provision, buried in the middle of the Act. Section 27 stated that any church that had been constructed with the approval of the Church Building Commissioners could not be demolished without the permission of the commissioners themselves. The permission had to be granted in writing, and it had to take into account the building's historical and architectural significance. St. Mary's had been constructed in 1875, which meant that it fell under the provisions of the 1845 Act. The Church Building Commissioners, like the Church Commissioners, had the authority to block the demolition. But there was a twist. The 1845 Act had been passed before the establishment of the modern Church Commissioners. The Church Building Commissioners had been folded into the Church Commissioners in the early 20th century, but the provisions of the 1845 Act had never been formally repealed. They were still in force, still enforceable. This meant that the developers were facing not one, but 2 separate legal obstacles. The Church Commissioners had the authority to block the demolition under the 2011 measure, and the Church Building Commissioners had the authority to block it under the 1845 Act. Even if the developers won their appeal against the 2011 measure, they would still have to contend with the 1845 Act. David smiled, a slow smile that spread across his face. This was a masterstroke, a legal maneuver that would leave the developers with no way forward. He drafted a response to the law firm, citing the 1845 Act and outlining the implications for their appeal. He pointed out that even if they won their challenge to the 2011 measure, they would still need to obtain permission from the Church Building Commissioners under the 1845 Act. And since the Church Building Commissioners were now part of the Church Commissioners, they would be unlikely to grant permission to demolish a church that had just been saved by their own organization. The response was a masterpiece of legal strategy, a document that left the developers with no way forward. David sent it off with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had once again found a forgotten law that could be used to fight for justice. The developers withdrew their appeal 3 weeks later. The church was saved, the community relieved, and David had added another victory to his growing list of successes. But more importantly, he had demonstrated the power of the forgotten law. The 1845 Act had been sitting on the statute book for over 170 years, largely forgotten, never used. But it had still been enforceable, still had the power to shape the present. David shared the victory with Emily, who had been following the case closely. "You did it, Dad," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You saved the church." "We saved the church," David replied. "I couldn't have done it without you." "We make a good team," Emily said, a smile spreading across her face. "We make a great team," David agreed. "Now, let's see what other forgotten laws we can find." The work continued, the database growing with each passing day. David and Emily had become a formidable partnership, a father-daughter duo that was using the law to fight for justice in ways that no one had ever imagined. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And they would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 30. The Legacy. The database was a living thing, constantly growing, constantly evolving. Every week, Emily added new laws, new provisions, new forgotten statutes. She had become an expert in the arcane world of obsolete legislation, a digital archivist who could find any law, no matter how obscure. David continued to use the database in his work, applying forgotten laws to new cases. He helped a group of residents block the construction of a toxic waste facility using an old public health statute. He helped a union challenge a corporate takeover using a little-known competition law. He helped a family fight eviction using a provision of the Rent Act that everyone had forgotten existed. Each victory was a testament to the power of the law, a reminder that the system could still work, if only someone was willing to fight for it. But David knew that the work was never truly finished. The legal system was vast and complex, full of forgotten provisions and obscure statutes. There would always be new laws to discover, new injustices to fight, new battles to win. He was sitting in his study one evening, reviewing the latest additions to the database, when Emily came in with a cup of tea. "I've been thinking, Dad," she said, setting the cup down on his desk, "about the future." The future? Of the database. Of the last appeal. Of everything we've built. David looked up, curious. "What about it?" "I think we need to think bigger," Emily said. "We've built something incredible, a tool that can change the world. But we are just two people. We can't do everything alone." David nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing. The work was growing, consuming more and more of his time. He was getting older, and he couldn't keep up the pace forever. "What do you propose?" he asked. "We need to expand," Emily said. "We need to bring in more people, build a team, create an organization that can carry on the work long after we are gone." David was silent for a moment, considering the idea. He had always been a solitary figure, a man who worked alone. The idea of bringing in others, of sharing his work with strangers, was uncomfortable. But Emily was right. The work was too important to let it die with him. He needed to build something that would last, a legacy that would continue to fight for justice long after he was gone. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." The expansion was gradual, a careful process of building a team of like-minded individuals who shared David's vision of using forgotten laws to fight for justice. They recruited lawyers, researchers, and activists, each one bringing their own unique skills and perspectives to the work. The team grew quickly, the organization expanding to take on more cases, more challenges, more battles. The database became the foundation of the work, a powerful tool that allowed the team to find forgotten laws and apply them to new situations. David watched the organization grow with a sense of pride and satisfaction. He had built something incredible, something that would continue to fight for justice long after he was gone. He had created a legacy, a testament to the power of the law and the importance of never giving up. The work continued, the battles ongoing, the victories stacking up. But David knew that the most important victory was the one he had already won. He had proven that the law could work, if only someone was willing to fight for it. He had shown that the forgotten statutes, the neglected provisions, the hidden weapons of the legal system, could still be used to expose the truth and bring the guilty to justice. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a champion of justice, a man who had turned his personal tragedy into a mission to help others. Chapter 31. The Pushback. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, embossed with the seal of the High Court of Justice. David had been expecting it, had known it was coming, really, ever since the church case had made national headlines. The legal establishment had been watching him for months, and now they were finally making their move. The letter was a summons to appear before Mr. Justice Harrington, one of the most senior judges in the King's Bench Division. The subject was listed simply as in the matter of the application of the Parish Vestries Act 1831 and related statutes. David read the letter 3 times, his heart sinking with each reading. This was not a routine hearing. This was a challenge to his entire methodology, a deliberate attempt to shut down the use of forgotten statutes in the courts. He called Emily into his study, handing her the letter without a word. She read it quickly, her face growing pale. "This is bad, Dad." "I know." "What are we going to do?" "We are going to fight," David said, his voice firm. "We've been fighting for 2 years. We are not going to stop now." But even as he said the words, David knew that this was different. The legal establishment was pushing back, using the full weight of the judicial system to stop him. He had been using forgotten statutes to win cases, and the courts had had enough. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving David time to prepare. He spent every waking hour in his study, reviewing the relevant case law, building his arguments, preparing for the battle that was coming. The day of the hearing arrived cold and grey, a typical London winter morning. David dressed carefully, choosing a suit that was conservative and professional. He wanted to project competence and respectability, not rebellion. The courtroom was packed when he arrived, filled with lawyers, journalists, and spectators. Mr. Justice Harrington was a tall, thin man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He had a reputation for intellectual rigor and a willingness to challenge established precedents. He was exactly the kind of judge who would be assigned to a case like this. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I have reviewed the materials you have submitted. I must say, your approach to the law is unconventional." David rose to his feet, his heart pounding. "Your Lordship, I have simply been applying the law as it is written. The statutes I have cited have never been repealed. They remain in force." "Remain in force," the judge repeated, his voice flat. "Mr. Mercer, I have reviewed the statutes you have cited. The Parish Vestries Act of 1831, the Church Building Commissioners Act of 1845, the Open Spaces Act of 1906. These are laws from another era, passed to address circumstances that no longer exist. Your Lordship, the circumstances may have changed, but the law has not. Parliament has never repealed these statutes. They remain on the books, and they remain enforceable." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Mercer, the doctrine of desuetude is well established in English law. A statute can fall into desuetude when it has been so long disused that it is no longer considered to have any legal effect. The statutes you have cited have been disused for decades, in some cases for over a century. Do you dispute this?" David felt his heart sink. The doctrine of desuetude was a legal principle that allowed courts to declare statutes obsolete if they had been consistently ignored for a long period of time. It was a dangerous doctrine, one that could be used to invalidate any of the forgotten laws he had been using. "Your Lordship, the doctrine of desuetude has never been formally adopted in English law. The courts have occasionally referenced it, but it has never been established as a binding principle. These statutes remain in force until Parliament repeals them." The judge was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming on the bench. "Mr. Mercer, I am going to rule on this matter now. I find that the statutes you have cited are functionally superseded by subsequent legislation and have fallen into desuetude. They are no longer enforceable in the courts of this land." David felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "Your Lordship." "I am not finished, Mr. Mercer." The judge held up a hand, cutting him off. "The use of these statutes is an abuse of the legal process. They were forgotten for a reason. They have no place in modern jurisprudence. I will not allow them to be used as weapons to circumvent the will of Parliament and the legitimate decisions of our elected officials." The courtroom was silent, the weight of the judge's words pressing down on everyone present. David sat down, his hands trembling, his mind racing. He had lost. The judge had effectively invalidated every forgotten statute he had ever used. But David was not finished. He had come too far to give up now. There were other courts, other judges, other avenues to pursue. He would not let this defeat stop him. The hearing concluded, the courtroom emptying. David gathered his papers, his movements mechanical, his mind still reeling from the judge's ruling. Emily was waiting for him outside, her face etched with worry. "Dad, what happened?" "We lost," David said, his voice flat. "The judge ruled that the statutes are no longer enforceable." Emily was silent for a moment, processing the news. "What are we going to do?" "We are going to appeal," David said. "We are going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if we have to. We are not going to give up." But even as he said the words, David knew that the battle was far from over. The legal establishment had pushed back, and the fight had just become much, much harder. Chapter 32. The Appeal. The Court of Appeal was a different beast entirely. Where the High Court had been a single judge, the Court of Appeal was a panel of three, each one selected for their legal expertise and their willingness to challenge established precedents. The panel that heard David's appeal was led by Lord Justice Carmichael, a formidable figure who had written extensively on statutory interpretation. The hearing lasted 2 days, with David arguing that the lower court had erred in applying the doctrine of desuetude. He cited case law from across the common law world, arguing that the doctrine had never been adopted in England and that the statutes in question remained in force. Lord Justice, The authorities are clear, David said, his voice steady. A statute cannot be repealed by disuse. Only Parliament can repeal a statute. Until Parliament acts, the statute remains in force. Lord Justice Carmichael leaned forward, his eyes fixed on David. Mr. Mercer, the doctrine of desuetude may not have been formally adopted, but the courts have long recognized that a statute can fall into abeyance. The statutes you have cited are from a different era, passed to address circumstances that no longer exist. Are you seriously suggesting that we should enforce a law from 1831? I am suggesting, Lord Justice, that the law is the law. Parliament has had ample opportunity to repeal these statutes. They have chosen not to. We cannot assume that they intended to repeal them just because they have been neglected. The panel deliberated for 3 weeks before issuing their ruling. The decision was unanimous, and it was devastating. We find that the statutes in question have been functionally superseded by subsequent legislation, Lord Justice Carmichael wrote. While the doctrine of desuetude has not been formally adopted in English law, the courts have long recognized that a statute can fall into disuse and lose its legal effect. The statutes cited by the appellant are from a different era and no longer reflect the intentions of Parliament or the needs of modern society. We therefore uphold the decision of the lower court. The statutes are no longer enforceable, and the appellant is prohibited from using them in future proceedings. David read the ruling 3 times, his hands trembling. He had lost. The Court of Appeal had upheld the lower court's decision, effectively invalidating the forgotten laws he had been using. But David was not defeated. He had one more avenue to pursue, one more court that could overturn the decision. He would appeal to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court was different from the lower courts. It was a court of final resort, a body that was willing to challenge established precedents and issue rulings that could change the course of the law. If David could convince the Supreme Court to hear his case, he might still have a chance. The application for permission to appeal was filed within days, a carefully crafted document that laid out the legal arguments in excruciating detail. David worked on it for weeks, consulting with legal experts, reviewing case law, building the strongest possible case. The answer came 3 months later. The Supreme Court refused to grant permission to appeal. The rejection was a crushing blow. The Supreme Court had effectively decided that David's case was not worth hearing, that the lower courts had been correct in their rulings. The forgotten statutes were dead, and there was nothing David could do to revive them. Emily found him in his study that evening, staring at the rejection letter. He had been sitting there for hours, his eyes fixed on the page, his face a mask of defeat. "Dad, we can't give up," Emily said, her voice fierce. "There has to be something we can do." "There's nothing," David said, his voice hollow. "The Supreme Court has spoken. The statutes are dead. There's nothing we can do." Emily crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "Dad, listen to me. You've fought for 2 years. You've won dozens of cases. You've helped hundreds of people. One setback doesn't change that." But David shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the letter. "It's not just a setback, Emily. It's the end. The legal establishment has closed the door. They've ruled that the forgotten laws are no longer enforceable. There's nothing left to fight for." Emily pulled back, her eyes blazing with a fire that David had never seen before. "There's always something to fight for, Dad. You taught me that. You showed me that the law can be a weapon, that it can be used to fight for justice. That hasn't changed. The law is still there. It's just different now." David looked up, meeting his daughter's eyes. There was something in her gaze, a determination that matched his own. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we need to adapt," Emily said. "The courts have closed off one avenue, but there are others. Other laws, other provisions, other ways to use the system to fight for justice. We just need to find them." David was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Emily was right. The courts had pushed back, but that didn't mean the fight was over. There were other ways to use the law, other strategies that could be employed. The forgotten statutes were dead, but the law itself was still alive. And David Mercer was still a lawyer, a man who knew the system inside and out. He could find other ways to fight, other tools to use. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's keep fighting." Chapter 33. The New Strategy. The defeat was a turning point, a moment that forced David to reconsider everything he had been doing. He had been using forgotten statutes as weapons, applying them in creative ways to win cases. But the courts had closed that avenue, ruling that the statutes were no longer enforceable. He needed a new strategy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a conversation with a young barrister named Thomas Chen. Thomas was a rising star in the legal profession, a man who had been following David's work with great interest. He approached David after a hearing, offering his assistance. "Mr. Mercer, I've been following your cases for months," Thomas said. "Your work is incredible, but I think you've been fighting the wrong battle." David was skeptical. "What do you mean?" "The courts have ruled that the statutes themselves are no longer enforceable," Thomas said. "But that doesn't mean you can't use the principles behind them. The statutes were based on certain legal principles, principles that are still relevant, still applicable to modern situations." David leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on." Thomas explained his theory. The forgotten statutes had been based on common law principles that predated the statutes themselves. The statutes had codified those principles, but they hadn't created them. The principles were still part of the common law, still enforceable. For example, the Parish Vestries Act of 1831 had codified the common law right of ratepayers to inspect local government records. The act had been invalidated, but the common law right remained. The courts might have closed off the statutory avenue, but the common law avenue was still open. David felt a surge of excitement. Thomas was right. The statutes had been invalidated, but the principles behind them were still enforceable. He could use the common law to achieve the same results, without relying on the forgotten statutes. "Thomas, this is brilliant," David said. "This is exactly what we need." "I'm happy to help," Thomas replied. "I've been looking for a way to make a difference. Your work has inspired me." Thomas joined the last appeal, bringing with him a fresh perspective and a deep knowledge of the common law. Together, they began to develop new strategies, new approaches that would allow them to continue fighting for justice. The first test came 3 weeks later, when a community group contacted David for help. A local council was planning to close a public library, a move that would deprive the community of a vital resource. The group had tried everything: petitions, protests, planning appeals, but nothing had worked. "We've been told there's nothing we can do," the group's leader said. "The council has the legal authority to close the library. There's no way to stop them." David and Thomas worked on the case together, developing a new strategy. They argued that the council's decision to close the library was unreasonable, that it failed to take into account the public interest. They cited common law principles of reasonableness and fairness, arguing that the council had acted irrationally. The case went to court, with David and Thomas presenting their arguments. The judge listened carefully, then issued a ruling that was a major victory. While the council has the statutory authority to close the library, the judge wrote, that authority is not unlimited. The council must act reasonably, taking into account the public interest. In this case, the council has failed to do so. The decision to close the library is therefore quashed. David felt a surge of triumph. They had won, using common law principles rather than forgotten statutes. The strategy had worked, and it had opened up a new avenue for future cases. Emily, who had been watching the case closely, was ecstatic. "You did it, Dad. You found another way." "We did it," David corrected. "We all did it. Thomas, Emily, everyone who helped. This was a team effort." "Team effort," Emily repeated, a smile spreading across her face. "I like the sound of that." The work continued, the new strategy producing victories that would have been impossible with the old approach. The common law was a vast and flexible system, full of principles that could be applied to modern situations. David and Thomas became experts in its use, finding new ways to fight for justice. The courts had pushed back, but David had adapted. He had found another way to use the law, another strategy that could achieve the same results. The forgotten statutes might be dead, but the principles behind them were still alive. And David Mercer would use them to fight for justice, no matter what the court said. Chapter 34, The New Order. The legal landscape had changed dramatically in the years since David had begun his work. The forgotten statutes had been invalidated, the courts had pushed back, and the establishment had closed the door on creative interpretations of the law. But the principles remained. The common law was still there, still enforceable, still a powerful tool for those who knew how to use it. David had built a new organization around these principles. The last appeal had grown, expanding to include lawyers, researchers, and activists from across the country. They worked together, sharing information, developing strategies, fighting for justice in ways that the legal establishment had never imagined. Emily had become a key figure in the organization, using her artistic skills to create powerful visual campaigns that drew attention to the cases they were fighting. Her paintings were exhibited in galleries across London, each one a commentary on the injustices of the legal system. They were beautiful and haunting, works of art that captured the imagination of the public and the attention of the media. Thomas Chen had become David's right hand, his partner in the fight for justice. He was a brilliant legal mind, a man who could find common law principles where others saw only dead ends. Together, they had created a new approach to the law, a way of fighting for justice that was both innovative and effective. The cases continued to come, each one a new challenge, a new opportunity to make a difference. David and his team fought for tenants facing eviction, for workers being exploited, for communities being destroyed by development. They fought for the voiceless, the powerless, the forgotten. And they won. Not every case, not every battle, but enough to make a difference. Enough to show that the law could still be a force for justice, if only someone was willing to fight for it. One evening, David sat in his study, looking out at the London skyline. The city was a sea of lights, each one a story, a life, a struggle. He thought about all the people he had helped, all the battles he had won, all the victories that had been achieved. He thought about the courts that had pushed back, the judges who had ruled against him, the legal establishment that had tried to stop him. They had closed one avenue, but he had found another. They had said he couldn't use the forgotten statutes, but he had used the common law instead. The law was a living thing, a vast and complex organism that was constantly evolving. It could not be constrained, controlled, or contained. It would always find a way to serve the cause of justice, if only someone was willing to fight for it. David smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. He had done what he set out to do. He had made a difference, had changed the world in ways that mattered. He had shown that the law could be a weapon, a tool for justice, a force for good. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with excitement. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. We just got word from the Court of Appeal. They've ruled in our favor in the latest case. We won." David turned to face his daughter, a smile spreading across his face. "That's wonderful, Emily. That's wonderful news." "I couldn't have done it without you," Emily said, crossing the room to hug him. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." "I couldn't have done it without you either, Emily. You've been my partner, my inspiration, my reason for keeping going." They stood together, father and daughter, looking out at the lights of the city. The future was uncertain, the battles ahead unending. But they would face them together, as they had faced everything else. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer, with his daughter at his side, would make sure that no one ever forgot again. Chapter 35. The Last Appeal. The name was ironic, really. David had chosen it years ago, in the depths of his despair, when he had been fighting alone against the system that had failed his daughter. The Last Appeal, it had been a declaration of intent, a promise that he would never give up, no matter how hopeless the fight seemed. Now, years later, the name had taken on a different meaning. The Last Appeal was no longer just a promise. It was a reality. The organization that David had built was the last hope for countless people who had been failed by the system, the final avenue for justice when all other avenues had been exhausted. David sat in his study, reviewing the files of the latest cases. The team had grown, the organization had expanded, the work had become more complex. But the mission remained the same, to use the law to fight for justice, to help those who had been forgotten by the system. Emily knocked on the door, entering without waiting for a response. She had been with him for years now, a partner in everything he did. She had grown into a brilliant advocate, a passionate fighter for justice, a woman who had overcome the worst that life could throw at her and emerged stronger than ever. "Dad, we've got a new case. A big one." David looked up, his interest piqued. "Tell me about it." Emily explained the case. A group of residents in a northern town were fighting against the demolition of their community center. The center had been a hub for the community for decades, a place where people gathered, children played, and lives were built. The council had decided to sell the land to a developer, and the residents had been fighting the decision for years. "We've tried everything," Emily said. "Petitions, protests, planning appeals. Nothing works. The council says they have the legal authority to sell the land." David nodded slowly. It was the same story he had heard 100 times before. A community fighting against the relentless march of development, a council ignoring the wishes of the people they were supposed to serve, a legal system that seemed designed to protect the powerful. "Let me think about it," he said. "I'll get back to you in the morning." Emily left, closing the door behind her. David sat in his study, his mind racing. The case was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to show that the law could still be a force for justice, an opportunity to prove that the forgotten principles of the common law could still make a difference. He reached for his laptop and began to search. He searched for common law principles, for case law precedents, for any legal argument that could be used to fight the demolition. He searched for hours, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his mind racing with possibilities. And then he found it. The common law principle of public trust was an ancient doctrine, one that dated back to Roman law. It held that certain resources, land, water, public spaces, were held in trust for the benefit of the public, and could not be alienated for private gain. The principle had been applied in English law for centuries, and it was still enforceable. The community centre was a public resource, held in trust for the benefit of the community. The council had no right to sell it, no authority to give it away for private development. The principle of public trust forbade it. David smiled, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. He had found another avenue, another way to use the law to fight for justice. The forgotten statutes might be dead, but the common law principles behind them were still alive. He worked through the night, building his case, preparing his arguments. The next morning, he presented his findings to the team. "We are going to fight this," he said. "We are going to use the principle of public trust to stop the demolition of the community centre." The team was skeptical. "The principle of public trust has never been used in this context," Thomas Chen said. "It's a risky strategy. We could lose." "We could lose," David agreed. "But we could also win. And if we win, we'll have established a new precedent, a new way of fighting for justice. It's worth the risk." The case went to court, with David arguing that the principle of public trust forbade the sale of the community centre. The council argued that the principle did not apply, that the community centre was not a public resource in the sense that the doctrine required. The judge listened to both sides, then issued a ruling that was both surprising and historic. "The principle of public trust is well established in English law," the judge wrote. "It dates back to Roman times and has been applied consistently in the courts of this land. The community centre is a public resource, held in trust for the benefit of the community. The council has no right to sell it, no authority to alienate it for private gain. The decision to sell the land is therefore quashed." David felt a surge of triumph as he read the ruling. He had won. The community centre was saved, the residents were victorious, and the principle of public trust had been established as a new weapon in the fight for justice. The victory was celebrated across the country, a testament to the power of the law and the importance of never giving up. The last appeal had done it again, had found another way to use the law to fight for justice. But for David, the victory was personal. It was a reminder of why he had started this work, of the promise he had made to his daughter all those years ago. He would never give up, never stop fighting, never lose hope. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. And David Mercer, with his daughter at his side, would make sure that no one ever forgot again. The final chapter of his journey was written not in victory, but in the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought. The legal establishment had pushed back, the courts had closed avenues, the system had fought against him. But he had adapted, had found new ways to fight, had continued the work that mattered most. He had built a legacy, an organization that would continue to fight for justice long after he was gone. He had inspired others to join the cause, to use their own skills and talents to make a difference. He had shown that the law could still be a force for good, if only someone was willing to fight for it. And he had done it all for Emily, for the daughter who had been attacked and had survived, who had found the strength to rebuild her life and become a force for justice in her own right. Emily knocked on the door, entering without waiting for a response. "Dad, I've been thinking," she said, "about the future. The future of the last appeal, of everything we've built. I want to take over the organization when you retire. I want to carry on the work." David looked at his daughter, a smile spreading across his face. "You know what, Emily? I think that's a wonderful idea." They stood together, father and daughter, looking out at the city that had been the setting for their greatest triumphs and their deepest sorrows. The future was uncertain, the battles ahead unending. But they would face them together, as they had faced everything else. The law had never failed. It had simply been forgotten. But David Mercer, with his daughter at his side, would make sure that no one ever forgot again.